This video is a collection of my stories about my Space Marines, known as the 13th. These stories were previously released individually over the last few years, but here in this video, they've been stitched together in timeline order. I thought it would be a good idea to present them like this because then you could listen to them all in one hit. Maybe have this video on in the background while you're painting away or trying to fall asleep. A bedtime story with Winter's SEO. We start with a quick introduction, and then part one is called The Start of Things, and it's sort of a second introduction, but these two intros, they're needed. They were cut from a longer piece I did way back in the day and form the foundation of what comes after. Part two and onwards, the true storytime videos start at around the 7-minute mark, and I'll pin a comment in the comment section, like the timestamps down there for everyone. So if you want to jump ahead, you can. Anyway, here's the introduction. The 13th Fleet is a coalition of humans and Astartes that has existed outside of Imperial control since the 13th founding at the end of M35, and for the first 1,000 years, however, they couldn't really call themselves a fleet. Back then, they were a very small band of Space Marines hunted and persecuted at every turn. And they grew in number and they shrank in number, but they were almost driven to extinction on more than one occasion. They came from many chapters, they wore many colours, and they were the remnants of the 13th founding chapters. Part 1. The Start of Things. As previously mentioned, this is sort of a second introduction which I felt needed to be inserted into the overall story arc. It's set 4,000 years ago and explains why the 13th started accepting humans into their number, how they went from a band of Space Marines to a fully fledged fleet. Viridia 12x12 was a gigantic refueling outpost at the very edge of Imperial space on the galactic fringe of the Orpheus sector, and in M3692 it had been smashed and rebuilt and smashed again by pirate raids, and then finally, at the stroke of an Imperial pen in a hive city a million light years away, it was marked down as a black asset. It was marked down as unrecoverable. Not worth the effort of saving. The people on Viridia 12x12 were never told, of course, and continued to fight and die when the raiders hit again and again, and they thought the spaceport could never be written off. They thought the spaceport was massive. It consisted over 250,000 souls, and it was guarded by 10 ships of the line, including battleships, and it was vital, and they believed it could never fall, and they were wrong. When the 13th intercepted the SOS, the spaceport had been unsupplied for 12 years, and only 20,000 souls remained, and only 3 ships of the line, and they'd been attacked and attacked again for a decade. They'd suffered more than 90% casualties. They'd lost 3/4 of their fleet. And back then, the 13th, we're talking 4,000 years ago now, had only 1 battle barge and 233 Astartes, not 20,000, 233. And still they decided to help. When the 13th translated in system 1 week later, the port was under attack yet again by dark Eldar pirates from the cabal of the Last Hatred. And the 13th were too late. Viridia 12x12 was broken, it was burning. 2 out of the remaining ships of the line were gutted and running cold, and the 3rd ship was burning for the Mandeville point to translate out of the system when the 13th appeared. And this cruiser, this ship, appeared to be the only thing left in the system. So for a day, these 2 ships would close in on each other at sublight speeds, the 13th going into the system, this cruiser coming out of the system. The Imperial cruiser refusing any hails from the 13th, but when the Astartes grew closer, they could see why. Auspex revealed the ship had been boarded and overrun, and it was now captained by the Dark Eldar. With the spaceport and all Imperial ships lost, it was clear the Xenos had won, and there was no one left to save. Despite this, and despite having only 200 plus Astartes to their name, the 13th boarded the cruiser anyway. Drawing lead on this mission was honoured brother Captain Pollux Matthias. While he would not survive this mission, the 13th won the day. The Xenos, who had been raiding Viridia 12x12 on and off for the best part of a decade without any sign of Imperial reinforcements, did not expect a battle barge to suddenly appear. So the Xenos they too were undermanned, no more than a few thousand Cabalites, the rest of their numbers having already fled back to the Webway, back to Cormorant, and they were not expecting the type of Space Marine they met that day. They did not recognize the chapter. The 13th bore no insignia or markings, nor could they determine any singular tactic, rather multiple tactics and multiple doctrines used by different squads at different times, and the sheer ferocity these Astartes unleashed, as though they were fighting for their lives, was something the Cabal of the Last Hatred were woefully unprepared for. And so it was, on the very bridge of the ship, when Captain Pollux Matthias fell under a hail of poisoned rounds, another Astarte stepped forward, then another and another. Each it would seem a captain in his own right. Each it would seem a hero from 1,000 worlds and 1,000 hells. And there was nothing the Cabal could do. They were broken. They were exterminated. It was after the battle was over the 13th found the navymen, over 8,000 people imprisoned in the holds below. They were the last survivors of the 250,000 people from Viridia 12x12, and in amongst them were women and children, starved, terrified, but saved from becoming cattle and playthings of the Dark Eldar. And the 13th, well, they would have left them then. They would have left them to find their own way in a brutal galaxy, as they had done before when they had rescued civilians. But honoured brother Captain Matthias had seen something in these humans, something of a kindred spirit perhaps. These mortals had been abandoned by the Imperium, and yet they had fought on and on for over a decade. And before then, they'd been subject to indiscriminate raids and brutal hardship. There was a fire in these people, an anger for vengeance and for justice, and like the 13th, they could call no planet their home, only the endless darkness of space. Perhaps Brother Matthias saw something of himself reflected in these people, and so he called for a cogitator and recorded his last decree. He had been led out in the infirmary. He had been told that his wounds were too grave and that his life was beyond saving. And as he lay there bleeding and dying, he ordered that his men must accept these mortals into their ranks if the people of Viridia 12x12 so wished. And they wished it. So the 13th Fleet began. The grand cruiser that the 13th had liberated was renamed the Start of Things. It was old and it was worn, but it was a grand cruiser, still 7 kilometers from bow to stern, and it would be the first of many. Because shortly after the 13th decided to add mortals to their ranks, the hunting and hiding started to end, and the rebuilding and the growing began. Over time, more ships were added to their ranks, and they went from strength to strength, eventually becoming a large fleet.
Part 2. All the stories that now follow are set in the modern timeline of the 41st millennium. This story is called The Face of the Sea.
Just as on Earth today, goods are ferried around from place to place inside trucks and transport ships, super containers that cross the ocean, carrying everything you can ever hope to buy. In the 41st millennia, millions of massive transport ships cross the void. And some are big, the size of city blocks, and some are bigger. And some are the size of cities, and some are much, much bigger still. They are the lifeblood of the Imperium, carrying everything from luxury goods to food to people. Yes, people. Human trafficking is not only legal in the 41st millennium, it's positively encouraged. The average citizen will never leave the planet of their birth unless they join the Guard or the Navy. And most of them never even leave the city or the habitat in which they're born. However, if a world needs resettling after it's been decimated, or if a forge world needs a few million workers, or for any other reason you might care to imagine, then massive conveyors are loaded with human cargo and sent off into the void. And in the case of the passengers packed inside the universe mass conveyor, the Face of the Sea, they were sent into space to die. The Face of the Sea was the last great ship to join the 13th Fleet, and this only happened about 500 years from the present day. In M4149, it left Primaris World Cable Harbour with 5 million souls on board, and it was registered to carry no more than 2 million. Why was the ship overloaded? Why were people on board sent into space to die? Well, to answer that question, I need to tell you a little story. The planet, Cable Harbour, was starving. It was buckling under its own weight. It could not ferry in enough supplies to feed the populace, and recent Xenos and Chaos incursions before the coming of the Great Rift on faraway worlds had stifled food supplies. And container transports laden with food were destroyed, and agri-worlds had been invaded and turned to dust. Of course, a local fleet had been sent to liberate the local agri-worlds and keep the shipping lanes open, but this fleet had failed, and Cable Harbour had starved. For a time, his Lord Governor, Palentis Mole, did not really care. He lived high above the common folk, at the highest point of the highest hive city, and all he would see when he looked down from the window was clouds, thick, rolling clouds of smog and filth, which from 5 miles up looked rather lovely to his eyes. All those yellows and browns. Of course, he would hear stories of unrest and the like, but he'd also hear stories about faraway wars and conquests and heroes and battles, and he preferred to listen to those kind of stories. Stories about his own planet were altogether rather depressing. Then there came periods of civil unrest, which rather troubled him, and then the money started to run out. And Mole was told by his closest advisors that Cable Harbour would soon be stripped of its title and no longer considered a primary world, and this rather displeased him, so naturally he asked why. He was told that 33%, a third of the taxable revenue was gone because 33% of the people had stopped living. And that's how they put it to him. They stopped living. Not that they had died or starved to death, but a third of the planet had just stopped living as though it was something they'd chosen to do. And to his ears, it sounded like heresy, like they'd stopped working, stopped bothering. So this got Lord Governor Palentis Mole all hot and bothered, and he decided the best thing to do was to wage war against the masses, to invade his own hive cities and kill as many people as he needed to until the rest decided to keep living. But when his military advisors told him that he could not afford enough could only afford enough Promethean to fuel half of his tanks, that the planet was that poor, well, that's when Mole got really, really annoyed. You see, Mole, he loved his tanks. He would drive around in them for hours shooting at things. He'd set aside miles of Hive City just for himself and his tanks. Anyway, this was quite possibly the worst news that Mole had ever heard. He declared to all his advisors that he wanted more money right now. Make it happen. And so his advisors told him how he could make money. A great deal of money. And that's when Lord Governor Palentis Mole started to sell people. He packed them into ships and sent them off in waves. The people, of course, had no idea where they were going. The starving masses were promised anything, everything, a life of farming or fishing, a life of plenty around a faraway sun. Hell, at this point, Mole could have promised them a crust of bread, and they would have left the planet. Remember, a third of the entire population had died before the news of mass starvation had even reached Mole's ears. So he sold people, waves and waves of people. Each wave of pilgrims was millions strong, and he did this again and again and again. In fact, he did this hundreds of times. I think by the end, he rather liked the ceremonies. Each ship was sent off amid a great fanfare of celebration. The larger the ship, the larger the party. And the Face of the Sea was the last great ship sent off into the void. And, as everybody who spoke with the governor said, the party was the grandest of all. A week-long lavish affair with Mole at its centre. Over the course of a number of decades, the governor managed to solve a population crisis without firing a shot. And when he finally died, he was hailed as a hero. The remaining population of Cable Harbour saw him as a saviour. He had led their parents and grandparents to promised lands in the sky. Before Palentis Mole, there had been starvation and disease and crowded, overflowing hab-blocks. And after his great pilgrimage, well, there was plenty of food and plenty of space for everyone. Within 100 years of his death, They raised statues to him on neighbouring planets. His fame spread far and wide, and 100 years after that, he was made a saint. Saint Palentus, the Void Weaver, he who guides those to distant shores. They build shrines to him, shrines, to this day. At first, Mole sold his human cargo to fabricator stations, mining complexes, forge worlds. This is a highly lucrative trade, by the way. When forced to by the Secta Imperialis, he sent out colony ships. Who knows, maybe some of these poor souls actually made it to half-decent destinations. But there wasn't very much money in colonial work, and he avoided it at all costs. Later, when he saturated the local markets with a few billion souls, he started to deal with rogue traders, and later still penal colonies and the occasional conscript regiment for the Imperial Guard. By the time of the 200th wave of mass transports, even the Guard didn't want them. But Mole liked the ceremonies, so he kept sending people until his dying day. Not one of the people on the ships were told where they were going. They were lied to. They were told anything, and they left willingly. And by the time the Face of the Sea was sent into the void, it was sent alone and without a destination. It had no escort carriers, it had no shielding, and no food, and no captain or crew to speak of, just mind-locked servitors hardwired into the machinery. The servitors pressed the buttons and pulled the levers and activated the warp drive, and so the Face of the Sea slipped into the warp without a navigator and without a functioning Gellerfield. The 13th Fleet found it in M4152, which is about 500 years from the present day, and at this time the Face of the Sea had been lost in space for a few hundred years. The 13th were anchored around an unremarkable star, uncharted, hiding in the dark. Ships of the line were coming and going, leading missions to distant shores, distant battlefields, and the ships of the estate were picketed close to the system core while the combat ships came and went. The defence monitors all strung out along them, forming almost fortress walls. Deployment was typical. Everything was safe and quiet, and while deployed, broad tether auspex scans were sent far and wide as fishermen might cast their nets out, and frigates and corvettes prowled the deep. And the auspex came back with something, a heat signature halfway to the ore cloud and about 1 month's hard burn distance. And the frigate, the last spear, was thrown out into the darkness to investigate, and a month later the last spear found a giant, 150 kilometers long, with reactors still churning. The Face of the Sea filled the scanners and blotted out the stars, and a second ship was embedded in its side like a tiny blade sticking out of the belly of a bear. The last spear was crewed by humans, not Astartes. The captain, a middle-aged woman by the name of San Gabon, had 200 Navy Militarum with the 13th Regiment beneath her, and they were all very, very nervous. They had not expected to find anything out here in the deep, let alone a behemoth. They established a safe and distant geometric orbit around the conveyor and began their scans. They noted the designation of the mass conveyor. They noted its port of harbour. They noted its name and history, and they found that it was lost to the warp 233 years earlier. And they found life signs. High wavelength auspex reported no more than 1,000 souls, but none of those persons were on the bridge. The bridge was empty. No navigators or astropathic responses. All scans showed that the life signs were found close to where the second ship stuck out of the side of the Face of the Sea like a small steeple from a church. They scanned the second ship. Dead, inert, reactor core ejected. Designation point of harbour. Name and classification unknown. Visual recordings determined it was Imperial design, but not a design the cogitators recognized, and that was most peculiar. The 13th do not like peculiar. Peculiar can get you into all sorts of trouble. So Captain Sangabon moved the last spear to a 10-kilometer orbit, switched to amber alert, fired up the shield arrays. She contemplated warming up her macro cannons as well. If the last spear was being scanned back, then pumping the reactor power into her primary guns would probably be noticed and would probably not be considered that friendly, but she fired them up anyway. And she waited 10 minutes, 10 long minutes, to see if she'd be met with any signs of aggression. When nothing happened, she launched a servitor drone for a closer visual inspection, reasoning that perhaps the cogitators could not recognize the second ship as half of it was buried in the face of the sea. The unthinking servitor drone flew right up to the surface of the ship and began scanning, pict reading, recording, and this is what they found. The second ship had not crashed into the face of the sea, but had merged with it, as though it had translated half inside of it. It was a military vessel, and it was old. All identifying features placed the date of the ship as Crusade or pre-Crusade era, and that meant the ship was over 10,000 years old, but it didn't look that old. The parts that could be seen anyway. It looked new. On the last spear, a message flashed up on the local cluster comms, and it said, "You had better come aboard." And the message had come from the face of the sea, evidently sent by a mid-range Vox unit, personal, low-tech. Sangamon stared at the message for a while and sent the reply, "Why?" She thought it was as good a response as any. The reply message flashed up. "Because he wants to see you." Who sent Sangamon? Didn't know what else to say. The message flashed back. The last Space Marine. An hour later, Captain Sangamon and 100 Navy Militarum were on board the face of the sea, an empty loading dock covered in filth, discarded machine parts, broken wall panels, broken deck panels. Only 1 in 10 lumen globes stuttered with light. Behind them, their transporters were steaming in the ripe air, and there was no one there to meet them. And for a few long minutes, they stood alone, listening to the ship creak around them. It felt like a dead thing. It smelt like a dead thing, as though they were inside the carcass of a great beast. Before leaving her ship and stepping on board the mass transporter, she had spoken to a number of people over the Vox, passengers on the face of the sea. Only they did not call themselves passengers, they called themselves survivors. She asked them where they'd been for the last 233 years and many other questions, and how they came to survive and who was the last Space Marine. And they answered. They said the face of the sea had passed into the warp with 5 million souls on board and no Gellerfields and no navigators, and as we all know, the warp is a hungry, thirsting realm of demons. And without the protection of the Gellerfields, it was like ringing a dinner bell or dropping a bloody juicy steak into a shark tank. The face of the sea was swarmed. Demons appeared on every deck. And first came the fast and small kind, then the bigger creatures, and then bigger still. The passengers on board the face of the sea were undefended. They were easy meat. They were picked apart. But the warp is a fickle thing, raw chaos. Time and space have no concept there, and all strange and impossible things can happen. And one of those impossible things happened. A second ship, a light cruiser, 2 kilometers in length, slammed into the side of the face of the sea while it was in the warp and fused with it. This ship did have a crew and functioning Gellerfields, and the people on board were very surprised to find themselves embedded in another ship. The second ship deactivated their warp drives, dropped back into real space, dragging the face of the sea with them and all the remaining passengers and all the demons too. Once in real space, many of the demons who had yet to find an organic host or did not have the anima to remain faded back into the warp, but that still left a whole lot of trouble behind. As well as the demon hosts, bloodborne and lesser and greater demons that had the will to remain, there was also 1 million plus humans who had been driven mad by the experience of being lost in the warp. No one could say how long the face of the sea had been in the Immaterium as well, whether it had been a few short minutes or years, and no one knew how infested the ship really was. But most of the people who were left alive on board were stark, raving mad, and there were demons everywhere still. And so the slaughter began, and eventually the fight back. The stark, raving mad killer survivors, well, they killed demons, and they killed each other too. And the demons, well, they also did a pretty good job of killing each other as well, as demons do. Slaanesh killed Khorne, Nurgle killed Siege, etc., etc. But really it came down to a few groups of survivors and diehards holding out here and there and barricading themselves away down below the bilge decks and gutter runs. And it came down to the Space Marines. There were 3 of them on board the second ship, and about 500 men-at-arms and 100 combat servitors. And at first they stayed aboard the remains of their own ship, which had been impaled into the face of the sea, and they battled to make it secure. Then after a week, they took the fight to the demons and the stark raving mad on board the face of the sea. To be fair, by this time there was very little left. The 5 million had been reduced to about, 50,000, and only about 1,000 were sane. Most of the demons had blinked back into the warp, and only the strong demons remained, and the strongest of the demons who had enough anima to remain. And of the 50,000 humans, only the strongest of the stark raving mad, who had formed into slaughter packs and drank blood and collected skulls, well, only they remained. It took many months for the 3 Space Marines to clear the entire ship, and by the end of their campaign, only one was left alive, the last Space Marine. He took control. He vetted the survivors, weeding out any warp taint, purging them with fire and sending them to the arms of the Emperor. And when that was done, he put the rest of the humans to work. Due to the high numbers of casualties amongst his own crew, there was enough food on his frigate to feed the 1,000 or so who was left for many, many, many years. But they had to work to earn their food, and that way a kind of society, a kind of order, a kind of routine was established, and that way they managed to survive. And the face of the sea tumbled slowly through the void for 13 years, until it was finally discovered by the last spear of the 13th Fleet. Perhaps it was Provenance. Captain Saint-Gabon jumped in surprise when the doors at the end of the docking bay groaned open, revealing a single lone figure. Big, power armor, Astartes. He came striding towards them. She tensed. Suddenly the 100 troopers she had with her didn't seem like enough. The Astartes wore an older mark of power armor, which did not bear any colours. It didn't reveal which chapter he was from. It was clean ceramite grey. A massive power sword hung from his hip, as long as she was tall, and he looked like a knight of old. He stood before her. He looked down at her. You, she swallowed. You are the one who saved this ship. He nodded. Who are you? I have learned that names have power, said the Space Marine, a calm, deep voice. I think I'll keep hold of mine. But who are you? She blurted. Your armor, it's bare plate. There are no chapter colors. What chapter are you from? Where are you from? I am not from a chapter. I came from a legion. But now I am a legion of one. I am a knight errant. I am chosen of Malcador, the Sigillite. Malcador, said Saint-Gabon. Sigillite. How? She muttered. What? How? What? The Space Marine spoke firmly, his voice like iron. I left the Sol system 5 years after the start of the Horus heresy. I was sent by my liege, Captain Garrow, to reach Macragge to find a way through the ruined storm. I was in the warp for 20 days before my ship met the universe mascom flare. When we translated out, we were 10,000 years in the future. Macragge, muttered Saint-Gabon. Sol. Garrow. More words were spoken, more tales were told, and eventually the last Space Marine, who would later become known as Brother Captain Sol Garrow, and the 1,000 survivors from the face of the sea, along with the universe mass conveyor itself, joined the 13th Fleet.
Part 3. Sol Garrow.
Who is he? We don't know. Well, does he have a name? He won't give it up. The crew on the last spear called him Sol Garrow. Sol Garrow. Why? He said he came from the Sol system, sent by Garrow. Brother Captain Trazius paused and looked through the armor-glass window to the airlock beyond, a vast space, big enough for a Questorus night. Empty now, save for a lone figure and Astartes in plain grey power armor, unpainted, unadorned. They had allowed him to keep his weapon, an old power sword, hung at his hip. The Space Marine stood in the center of the chamber, unmoving, staring straight back at Trazius through the armor glass. His gaze was unnerving. How many other survivors? Over 1,000, all civilian. He saved them all. Matthias should talk with him, said Trazius, turning away. Really? For one Astartes? The warp brought this man to us, and I would find out why, said Trazius. Honored brother Matthias dreamed. He dreamed of a moment that was 4,000 years old, or was it a memory of a dream? Difficult to tell, difficult to know. So much time and so many dreams had passed, and his mind was not the same. It worked differently, now he was dead. And he had been dead for a long time, for 4,000 years. He dreamed that he was stood in the grand gallery of Lord Inquisitor Hume, with his battle brothers and a man he respected beyond all others, Chapter Master Manus. The gallery could have been a ballroom on an Imperial Guild world. So grand was its design, its pictures and frescoes and statues, but for the thrum of the ship's engines and the massive steel screen window at the far end of the hall that looked out into the stars and the black beyond. The window dominated the space like a void, a hole into midnight, and Hume was stood on a raised platform before it, shouting, pointing, and making accusations. Hume and his retinue outnumbered the Space Marines 10 to 1. Most of them were armed and armoured, and wore colours as brash and as loud as the Lord Inquisitor. They looked at the ragged band of Space Marines with scorn. Space Marines dressed in mixed and patched battle plate from various colours, from various chapters now extinct. The Space Marines looked like they had been through hell, and many of them had, quite literally. I told you to bow, said Hume, pointing at the chapter master. I told you to kneel. I order you to kneel. I am Chapter Master Manus. I do not bend. And why not? The reign of blood is over. A new political order rises. A new imperium is born. You will submit. I represent the authority of the God Emperor of man. The Emperor is our creator, not a god. We are his weapons, and weapons do not fear or care about political order. We are his weapons, and we wage his war, not the Imperium's, and not yours. Then Matthias saw what he had seen 1,000 times before, what he had been unable to stop then, and what he was unable to stop now. The assassin materialized behind Manus, a plasma gun in its hand, pointing at the back of the chapter master's bare head. Suddenly, instantly, the assassin pulled the fig trigger, and the last surviving chapter master of the 13th founding died. Light flashed, vision, sound, heat, sensation. His dead mind was being brought back to life. He was being woken. War. He would get to kill again. He would bring ruin to the enemies of the Emperor one more time. The dream state vanished as the real world came flooding back, and he could feel the weight of time and the weight of memories, too many to count. He could see the arming chamber, deck plates, wall panels, cogitators flashing, lumen bulbs flickering with heat, and baskets of incense hanging from old brass chains. Coolant vapours misted across the floor. A tech marine stood below him, tapping on a data slate. A red target lock flickered over the figure and then turned blue. Information flooded his cortex as the machine spirit whispered to him. Data scrolled down the right side of his vision. Reactor power, full. Motive systems, active. Vox, audio and other active and passive systems charged and alert. No mission data, troubling. Ammo count, 0. Weapon systems, 2 dreadnought power fists. He had arms, 2 industrial-sized machine arms. All this data took Matthias less than a second to process, and immediately he knew he was not being roused for war. If he could have sighed, he would have. Instead, he bent slightly and growled through a dreadnought speaker. "Who is it this time?" "Sire," said the tech marine, bowing and stepping back. "Captain Trazius seeks your counsel." Honoured brother Matthias detested ceremonies. At least he had not been working for a ceremony. But it was not war, and he was not pleased to hear what Trazius had to say, and he let the captain know it. Trazius apologized more than he should have, more than was fitting for an Astartes of the 13th, and Matthias let him know that too. He was stood with Trazius outside the massive airlock, and in the next chamber, the unknown warrior waited, still standing, still looking straight at the armor-glass window. Matthias turned his massive frame to look back. "Why keep him in the airlock?" "So we can vent if we need to." "Where are we?" "Nowhere." Matthias did not nod, could not nod. His dreadnought frame was not built to respond with subtlety. It was built for ruin and murder. But he understood the reference. To the 13th, nowhere meant deep space, the empty void between star systems. If they vented the chamber with Matthias and the unknown Astartes inside, Matthias would drift for a time until they recovered him. He rather liked the thought of it, floating alone in the black. "So you want me to talk with him?" said Matthias. It was not a question. "He could be a candidate. He saved lives, fought a demonic infestation." "He could be an enemy." "Which is why we seek your counsel, and the librarius will be listening." A short time later, the airlock blast doors grumbled open and Matthias thumped his way inside. The lone space marine in the center of the chamber turned, looked, and waited. Matthias did not know what he expected from the man, but this was not it. Even Astartes tended to take a step back, or at least bow prolifically when he made an entrance. A 10-ton walking killing machine tended to tug on an instinctive part of the brain, a primal part of the brain. But this man just stood and watched him come. It was not until Matthias stopped a few paces away and the blast doors behind him slid shut did the space marine bow his head slightly and said, "Honoured brother, and they shall know no fear." "Is that why they sent you? Fear?" "No. The intention is dialogue. My counsel is respected." The lone space marine nodded, showing that he understood the game, the feeling out process, the start of things. "My name is Matthias," said the dreadnought. "Unusual," said the space marine. "No honor rolls, formal titles." "We are averse to titles." "And no insignia, no chapter markings, oath markings, or velt, as our wolf brothers would say. No story." "And you?" said Matthias, raising one power fist and pointing at the plain, grey ceramite of the space marine's power armor. "Still, you have not given your name." "Call me Solgaro. I spent a month in the company of the crew from the last spear when it returned to your fleet. It seemed to work for them." "You can see how this might be a problem," said Matthias. Solgaro nodded. "You do not let your titles define you. Why?" "Precisely because titles define, and the lens of the Imperium is cracked. Its vision is slurred with age and dogma. Definitions slide out of focus into some other place that's unrecognizable to those that follow the imperial truth." "You fear you will be misrepresented?" "We are misrepresented. We are the 13th, the last surviving sons of the 13th founding, and we do not fit the narrative." "Neither do I," said the space marine. He paused then, lost in a part of his mind that Matthias could not follow. "Why is your name significant?" asked Matthias. "Because I know him, and he doesn't know I am here. And if my name became known and spreads as these things do, he might see me coming." Solgarrow looked up, straight at the dreadnought's visual systems. "And I don't want him to see me coming. I'm going to kill him." "Who?" asked Matthias. "Abaddon," said the Space Marine. Over the next few hours, the room outside the massive airlock became crowded with Astartes as more and more members of the 13th Fleet came to hear Solgarrow's story. Trazius was the first to send a call over the Vox, so that other officers could hear directly, and he would not have to repeat himself later. They, of course, called others. Within half an hour, a dozen Space Marines stood silently listening and staring through the armor-glass window at the stranger in the dreadnought. Half an hour later, there were 24 brothers. No one spoke. Everyone listened. Solgarrow said he was a legionary from before the Horus Heresy, 10,000 years earlier. When the heresy started, he became a knight-errant, chosen by Malcador the Sigillite, one of an elite handful of brothers who did the Sigillites, and by extension the Emperor's, bidding. At the time of the heresy, starship travel from one side of the galaxy to the other was made impossible by the ruin storm, a disturbance in the warp. The Sigillite was keen to see if the Ultramarines could be reached on the other side of the ruin storm, and sent Solgarrow and 2 of his brothers to make the attempt. And so they had left the Sol system and translated into the warp, and then somehow, in that impossible dimension where time and space have no real meaning, the impossible happened. Their frigate met another ship, crashed into it, merged with it, so they dropped out of the warp and back into real space, dragging the other ship with it, and when they did so, they were 10,000 years in the future. The ship they had merged with was the mass transport conveyor, the Face of the Sea. It was infested with demons and a few thousand human survivors. Solgarrow and his men eventually purged the conveyor of the demons and made it safe. This fight took months and claimed the lives of his 2 brother Astartes. Once the fighting was over, there was no way back into the warp and no way to complete his mission. Not only had 10,000 years passed, but both ships were no longer warp viable. He was adrift in space, a man out of time, with 1,000 civilians under his care. And they drifted for 13 years until the last spear of the 13th Fleet found them. During those 13 years adrift in space, Solgarrow had spoken with the survivors on board the Face of the Sea and plundered the ship's data stacks for information. He discovered where he was and when he was. Some truths were harder to swallow than others, such as the ecclesiarchy and the rise of the imperial cult. Some almost crippled him. The Emperor's fate on the Golden Throne was one such thing. Solgarrow talked about that for a while. "I saw him once," he said, matter-of-factly. Matthias, who had been pacing the deck plates for some time, stopped suddenly. "You saw the Emperor?" "At Ullanor, the great procession, and many of the Primarchs." "The triumph of Ullanor," said Matthias, his vox speaker low, humbled. "A thing of legend. The histories speak of thousands of Astartes and millions of guardsmen." "There was more than that, many more," said Solgarrow. "The Mechanicum had levelled an entire continent, and still it was not enough. Hundreds of thousands of legionaries. The Imperial army numbered more than 1 billion. Columns of armoured vehicles stretched over the horizon. More Titans than I thought existed. The sounds they made. And the air was so thick with ships you could barely see the sky. It was breathtaking, even for an Astartes. There was a pavilion at the end of the parade, over 100 meters high, and on it, the Emperor and 9 of the Primarchs. We marched past, our heads high. As I walked past, the Emperor turned his face down and looked straight at me. Now, You may not believe me. He was so high up and there were so many men. But I tell you, when the master of mankind looks you straight in the eye, you know. All my brothers knew it too. The next day my captain came to see me, to congratulate me. He had seen it. They had all seen it. I asked him what he thought it meant. He just said that I was destined for great things. Matthias said nothing for a moment. He had been alive in one form or another for 4,000 years, and it took something truly remarkable to make him pause. This made him pause. Perhaps your captain was a wise man, said Matthias finally. What was his name? Sol Garrow took a couple of steps back and said, Abaddon. Now it was clear that the Space Marine was preparing to run, perhaps understandably afraid that an angry dreadnought was about to charge him down, but Matthias stood motionless. He was motionless because Matthias immediately voxed through to Seibolt of the Librarius. Seibolt told him that Sol Garrow was free of warp taint and that he spoke the truth, or that truth bled from his every word, as Seibolt put it. So while the stranger had intoned Abaddon's name for a second time, there was the other matter to consider. This man was sent from Malkador, the Sigillite. He had drifted in space for 13 years on board the mass conveyor until the 13th Fleet had found him. He had been sent to reach the Ultramarines, the 13th Legion. The signs were there for anyone to see, so bright as to be obvious for someone as long-lived as Matthias. In the next room, things were not going so well for Captain Trazius. An argument broke out among the Astartes, and some of the loudest proponents said that they should vent the airlock. It took Trazius longer than he would have liked to quell the dissenters. As far as he was concerned, honoured brother Matthias's wisdom was to be trusted. There was a reason Trazius had woken the ancient, and Sol Garrow's revelations only confirmed them. Matthias spoke again, and the gathering behind the armour glass fell silent and listened. You are a son of Horus. Some of us preferred the old names. We were wolves once. Nevertheless, your kind now worship the ruinous powers. There are none of my kind. I am the last. And despite these things, you would have me believe that Malkador trusted you? I'm not sure Malkador trusted anyone other than the Emperor. He was an impossible person to read. You met the Sigillite in person? Asked Matthias. On occasion. Matthias paused, another internal vox hailed to the librarian. Seibolt continued to affirm that everything Sol Garrow said was true, powerfully true, the old librarian mumbled. Fratricide, that's how it started, said Sol Garrow. I read everything I could find on board the Face of the Sea, but much of your history of the heresy is propaganda or lies. Nowhere could I find mention of Istvan III. Istvan V, the drop site massacre, there was tiny scraps hidden here and there, lost amongst the noise and the fairy tales. But Istvan III, my guess is the information has been redacted or destroyed. There were loyalists amongst the traitor legions once. I suppose if that became widely known, some might ask if there were traitors amongst the loyal legions, and there were. At the very start, everything was grey. The dividing lines were less clear. Matthias fell silent. The pneumatics of his dreadnought suit purred to a stop, and he listened. He listened to a story that very few in the 41st millennium had ever heard. He listened to a story of betrayal. Sol Garrow spoke briefly about the crusade, and then spoke of Ullanor, where Horus became the war master and the Emperor had returned to Terra. That was the point when things had started to change, he said. Slowly, so slowly at first. Then he spoke for some length about the years in the run-up to the betrayal, how his legion changed from the Lunar Wolves to the Sons of Horus, and how the character of the legion changed with it. A planet called Murder, an extinct species called the Interrex, a moon in the Davin system. Perhaps these were details he did not need to add, but add them he did. painting a story of decline from something grand and worthy to something cracked, something out of focus. Then, Istvan III. Horus's first act of betrayal was against his own legion. It was a purging of the ranks, homicide against those who would not turn traitor, who would not turn against the Emperor's light. Perhaps a third of his legion, as well as a third of the Death Guard, World Eaters, and Emperor's children, were slaughtered at Istvan III, slaughtered by their own legions, by their own brothers. I was under the Coral City in the transit lines when they dropped the virus bombs and burned the world. My squad was returning to the surface when the gas came, covering everything, eating through everything. Metal turned to rust. Rubber seals corroded and dripped away like wax. Glass turned to powder. My squad fell where they stood. I was on the edge of this walkway. I ran and jumped down onto a metal grate that was blistering and breaking under the gas. I went straight through that and down into the sewers under the city. There was a current there, rivers and rivers of filth and waste. I was carried some distance before the gas was ignited. Then the air caught fire, the water boiled away, and the tunnels caved in. I don't know how long I was down there. I know that by the time I had dug myself out, the war had moved on and the world was dead. About a year later, someone came looking. They took me off-world, back to Terra. I met the Sigillite. I did his bidding, and now, here I am. Sol Garrow unbuckled the sword that hung at his waist and turned it over in his hands. The scabbard was plain and unremarkable. He drew the sword. The metal was blue and milky. Strange energy signals registered in the dreadnought's visual sensors. He gave me this, the Sigillite, said Sol Garrow, just before I left for my mission through the ruin storm, and he said the strangest thing. Sol Garrow stood to attention and lit the blade. Blue-white, its energy shield perfect and smooth, flawless. He said, "Take this blade. Find the 13th. You fight for them now." The Lunar Wolf stared up at the dreadnought. Matthias paused, considering all that he had heard, and then spoke loudly, so that those behind the armor glass would hear clearly. "Well then, brother, welcome to the fleet."
Part 4. Snow.
Much like life in the wider Imperium, civilian life in the 13th Fleet is highly structured and hierarchical. What do I mean by that? Well, there are very few rich and powerful individuals, people who may have once commanded armies or ruled worlds or outposts. When these type of individuals join the fleet, they tend to bring a lot with them, like the odd spaceship or army. The most noted person would be Samros of Cadenhall. He was once a planetary governor, and when he joined the fleet, he brought the battleship the Invincible with him. Samros became a well-remembered, well-respected member of the fleet, and he died during the Chaos Uprising of M3838. He's remembered to this day. Then there are a few individuals who are quite well off, quite comfortable, such as Archmagos Low 12 Sigma. He's been around for about 3,000 years now, the master of the fabricator ships. He and his tech adepts make machines that make machines, and the fleet would fall apart but for his holy knowledge. Or the radical Inquisitor Kalen Dyke, who was once chased from the Ordos for calling on the 13th Astartes for aid when no one else would answer the call. Then there are the shipmasters of the Navy, or the generals of the 13th Militarum, or the prefect of the Daughters of the 13th, a fighting force comprised solely of women. Then there are the sanctioned rogue traders, who call the fleet their home, each a king aboard their own ship. Yes, there are some among the fleet who are super rich, and then those that helped shape the fleet and helped it grow. Then there are those that help keep it in the air and keep it functioning, and they're wealthy enough. These groups have influence and power, and they're rewarded for their contributions. Then there's everyone else, the struggling poor, that make up the remaining 90%. And then there is a small underclass, those that live in the bilge decks and pick over the scraps. So most people have it bad. But, and I can't stress this enough, nowhere near as bad as almost every other place to live in the Imperium. Everyone has shelter and food. Everyone is assigned a bunk, a place to rest, and everyone can get free food. Yes, free food. You might be the lowest ganger from the bilge decks, but you can get a free ration, a slab of binaric protein once a day, every day from one of the mess halls. Of course, given a choice, most people would rather not feed their pets a slab of binaric protein, but then most people in the fleet do not have pets on account that the gangers in the bilge decks have eaten them all. Also, and rather deliberately, all work on board the 13th Fleet is not soul-crushingly boring and without purpose and meaning as it is in the wider Imperium. Work aboard the civilian ships, the ships of the estate, is split along two separate lines. You either serve the ship itself, you're a civilian rating, a fleet hand, or you help look after the people, you're a Silos Ministorum or a guild worker. And these two tasks are set up with one goal in mind, which is to help support the wider fleet itself. Now, most civilians on the 13th can be found on board the Universe mass conveyor, the Face of the Sea. 1 million people live on this behemoth. It's a floating city with shops and habs, places of work and places of rest. But the accommodation on the Face of the Sea is rather Spartan, rather basic, and those with any sort of money or standing live on one of the other ARC ships. There are 11 other transports, and all of their populations combined do not add up to half of the number of people on board the Face of the Sea. Kylos was a tub docker on board the Eagle Remembers. The Eagle was a fine craft, a gravity-class conveyor, over 3 kilometers long and registered to carry 30,000 souls. A crew of 200 kept the ship in the sky, kept it flying, kept it breathing. They were afforded a rather comfortable life, as the Eagle Remembers was one of the grand ships. The passengers were veterans, and they never numbered 30,000 strong, typically no higher than 10,000. They came from the Navy or Army Militarum. They were sailors or army grunts, officers and fleet masters, medics or brute squad sergeants. For most, a military history service ended in death. These were the unlucky few, those who wish they had died, those who had seen all their friends, their comrades, die around them. Yes, life on board the Eagle was quite comfortable. There was a viewing deck where a vast crystal dome stared out at the black, and down in the hive decks there were open spaces and plazas. But these were men and women that woke up screaming. They dreamed of horrors. They dreamed of frozen corpses tumbling through the hard vacuum of space. They dreamed of worlds on fire. They dreamed of demons. To the rest of the fleet, the men and women on board the Eagle were heroes, some of them very well-known heroes. However, it was very rare for a veteran to be returned to the general population, partially because it never goes well when you meet your heroes, but particularly if you find out that your heroes cry themselves to sleep at night, or that they are horribly scarred and maimed, or that they are frighteningly dangerous as the last die hard in the foxhole, lying quietly in the blood and entrails of his brothers for days, waiting for the monsters to go away. Kylos was none of these things. He was not a veteran, he was not a navyman, he was a fleet hand, manual classification, guild worker, a tub docker. This earned him a billet in shared quarters, a ration of coin, 2 rest days every 20, which he spent in the big city, the name that civvies gave to the Face of the Sea. Kylos was assigned to docking hole 7 on the Eagle Remembers, and he moved tubs on and off the ship. Tubs are small, self-propelled cargo containers that move between ships. They're about the size of an armoured personnel carrier, like a chimera, and they're piloted by mindless servitors, and they transport anything and everything the fleet might need. The most common goods would be foodstuffs from the hydroponic vat ships that serve the fleet. The least common would be personal items mailed from one ship to another. Tubs do not have life support systems. They're not rated to carry humans. They're basically simple metal transportation boxes with thrusters on the side and a mindless servitor up front. Kylos would count them on and off the Eagle Remembers. He would check them for wear and tear, scrub soot from the thrusters and knock interstellar ice from the door seals. He knew them all by name and by sound. He would count them in through a hole through the side of the ship, check them for clearance, and then send them to the unloading bay. No tub passed through to the unloading bay without first being inspected by Kylos, and no tub left the ship unless he signed it off. He thought it was an important job. It wasn't. He ran a bioscanner over the tubs every time to check for life signs. It never, ever registered a life sign. But he did it anyway, every time, without fail, because he thought it was an important job. The people who put the boy inside the tub probably didn't count on that, because one day, when Kylos was scanning one of the line of tubs, the bioscanner beeped. He looked at the scanner for what must have been a whole minute. It had never beeped before, not once in 18 years. He passed it over the tub again. Beep. He passed it over the tubs either side. No beep. He looked at the encryption lock on the side of the tub. He didn't have a key. He pressed random buttons anyway. Nothing happened. He held up the bioscanner again. Beep. Blinking, he went over to the centrist cogitator and aborted the tub. Nothing happened. The tub was suspended on rails that crossed the ceiling, and what should have happened was the rail should have switched and grumbled, and the tub should have slid away onto a holding line. But that didn't happen. Nothing had happened. Someone with a higher clearance than Kylos had overridden the control system. He pressed the big red button. System full stop. Nothing. Someone had definitely overridden the controls. He checked the release cycle. 3 minutes to drop and counting. He pressed the system full stop again. Nothing. In the years that followed, whenever Kylos told the story of this day, he said he did it out of duty. He did it because it was the right thing to do. And what he did was climb into an enviro suit and load himself into an empty tub. This is after he matched the second tub to the first tub on the destination roster, so that the second tub would follow the first wherever it went. It was a pretty standard, pretty simple procedure. Why he really did it, he could not say. He had some vague idea that he might be able to grab whatever it was in the first tub when he got to wherever it was going, and then send him and his prize straight back, so no one would be the wiser. But really, he had no idea. So he stuffed himself into a spacesuit and then climbed into a tub and locked down the hatch, and then wondered what on earth he was doing there. His little box clanked off the rails, through docking hole 7 and into space. And it was worse than he could have imagined. It was pitch black inside the tub, utterly silent, freezing cold, and completely disorientating. One moment he was floating in 0G, the next pushed against the metal walls when the thrusters kicked in, then floating, then pushed against the walls, in the black, in the cold, and it lasted for hours, and hours, and hours. When gravity and warmth finally came back to his world, he was half awake. His Evo helmet was full of vomit. His eyes were full of mist and stars. There was a banging and a clanking, then light happened, so much light. When Kylos came to his senses, he discovered the tub had come to a full stop inside the hull of the cage, and it was the last place he wanted to be. In space, no one can hear you scream. Also, resources are rather scarce. One resource over almost all others is very valuable, and that resource is people. From the beginning, when the Astartes of the 13th saved their very first ground cruiser, the start of things, they learned the value of people. People were the reason the fleet grew, the reason the fleet expanded and survived. The fleet became as important to the 13th as the 13th were to the mortals they protected. But people are people, and people do bad things or questionable things or really rather stupid things, and so the cage was born. A prison ship with a purpose. If you were sent to the cage, you could only earn your way back to the fleet through military service. Thus it functioned as a clearinghouse. It funneled people into conscript regiments, and those that survived their tours were allowed to return to the fleet. They didn't go to the Eagle Remembered, because the conscripts were dealt with in a very specific and different way to normal conscripts. However, I need to qualify the term regiment at this point. On a planet, it's easy to round up 1,000 men and or women and create a regiment. In space, not so much. So the regiments of the 13th are 100 persons strong, as a Space Marine company is 100 persons strong, and as you can tell, the influence of the Astartes of the 13th runs deep. It flows through the veins of the fleet. So the conscript regiments raised on the cage were 100 persons strong, and many of them never actually saw war, not true brutal war. The conscripts were used to dig trenches or latrines or sweeping clear after a battle was won. They were used in a myriad of different ways, but they were not used as they might be if they were a standard conscript regiment from the wider Imperium. They were never marched forward into a minefield to clear mines. They were not used as human shields and marched into a blizzard of guns ahead of shock troops. They were never used to bubble wrap artillery columns. The many and brutal ways a conscript's life was spent in the wider Imperium did not apply to the conscripts of the 13th. They were a scarce resource and used in very bespoke ways. It was a curious arrangement, but it worked, and as most of them never actually saw war, when they'd finished their tours, they were allowed to return to the fleet. Kylos had never dreamed of a life in the army. He didn't want to be a hero, but you rarely got what you wanted in the Imperium, and the last thing he wanted to be was a father. But when the boy was pulled out of the other tub, the tub he had followed all the way through deep space, he became a father of sorts. The boy was 4 years old. He was called Julius. He had lived with his grandfather on board the Eagle, remembers, a retired colonel and decorated veteran. Julius remembered that the colonel was very loud and an angry man. He was often shouting and arguing. He also remembered that at night, every night, the colonel would wake up screaming. The colonel taught Julius 2 things. The only true family that you will ever have is the family forged in war, the brotherhood of warriors, those people who will fight for you and die for you on the battlefield. That, Julius was told, was true family. Julius was not true family. The second thing he was told again and again was to never be afraid. Fear was useless. Either the emperor protects or he doesn't. Fear was useless. No fear. No fear. So when 2 strange men came into Julius's bedroom late one night, he was not afraid. He fought, he kicked, and he called for his grandpa, but he did not cry out. He did not scream. He was 4 years old. They put him inside a hibernation pod the size of a footlocker, and as the door to the pod sealed shut and the chems started to kick him, he saw his grandfather peer through the glass window on the hibernation pod. The colonel was smiling. It was the first and the last time Julius would ever see him smile. Good for him, he heard the old man say. Toughen him up. Then he fell asleep. The hibernation pod went in the tub, and the tub was sent to the cage, and when he woke it was to find Kylos staring down at him, trying to rouse him from his slumber. We gotta go, kid. Back to the Eagle. In the end, they never returned to the Eagle, remembers. Once on the cage, there were only 2 ways off the cage, absolution or death, and only one of them found death. Of course, in the beginning, Kylos had tried to explain his predicament to the officers and the NCOs on board the cage, but it was no use. No one cared how he got there. They only cared that, now he was there, he would serve his time. And the standard service time for a conscript was 3 tours, just 3 tours. Given that elements of the 13th were active in multiple war zones across multiple sectors, it typically took a regiment about 2 years, 2 Terran years to complete. But for Kylos and the boy, it would take 6 years before their very first tour. The boy went to classes 4 hours a day, there was a scholar on board the cage, and spent the rest of his time with Kylos running drills, polishing boots, cleaning las carbines, mopping floors, and getting yelled at. A lot. The boy stuck to Kylos like a bad memory, followed him everywhere, and the boy saved his life 12 times. Kylos did not know it, but he would have been packed off to the line to serve with the other conscripts within months of his arrival on the cage, but he was held back for 6 years. 6 long, hard years. If he had been packed off, he would have died 12 times over, but he was held back to help raise up the boy. He became a de facto father, and it was on Julius's 10th birthday, when the boy was old enough to be conscripted, He and Kylos were immediately transferred to the line. Julius thought it was the best birthday he had ever had. By the age of 10, after 6 long years of indoctrination and training and propaganda, the boy was a zealot. He was hardwired to kill the enemy of man. Kylos was a nervous, middle-aged man with a skin problem. He'd gotten used to the grind on the cage and didn't want to go anywhere, and he rather liked looking after the boy. Not that he had ever considered himself a father or anything, but he rather liked the fact that someone looked up to him. No one had ever looked up to Kylos, the tub docker, before. But they were rotated into the line. The 2nd 117th Conscript Regiment of the 13th Militarum stationed on board the cruiser She Knows No Fear. Within a week they had left the fleet. A short warp jump later and they were in their first war zone. Gideon's Landing. Enemy classification. Insurrection. Chaos. Gideon's Landing was a blood-soaked world. Its cities had fallen and the skies had turned black with atomic fires. Forests had been turned to tinder, mountains crushed into rubble, and seas boiled away. It was the first world that Julius had ever set foot on, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. While everyone else saw ruin and the scars of war, the boy only saw a white and glittering world. A thick, perfect white blanket covered everything. It shined like starlight. It made a funny sound when you trod on it. It was as cold as an outlayer airlock. He asked Kylos what it was. Nuclear fallout. Just nuclear fallout, came the reply. But the white stuff, Julius asked. What's the name of the white stuff? Snow. And for the first 3 days, Julius would not stop talking about the snow, playing in the snow, eating the snow, the irradiated snow. No matter how many times he was ordered not to, he would just not shut up about the snow. The other troopers started to call him Snowboy, and then they just called him Snow. On the 4th day, they met the enemy. They had been stationed at a prefab landing area, helping ferry supplies off the planet. Some of these supplies were people, survivors, they were told. It was all pretty standard, they were told. Apparently the main war, the Great War, which had broken the planet and left it an empty shell, had finished many years ago. But apparently there were still people fighting each other somewhere in the ruins. Apparently this was all very standard. The conscripts of the 2nd 117th were stationed in the van, loading and unloading light transport ships that dropped down through the blackened clouds. They worked like servitors. They worked alongside servitors. It was hard work. An enlisted regiment of militarum, complete with tanks and light armour, guarded the landing area, and one Astartes, one Space Marine, was stationed back with the van as well. It was the first Space Marine that the boy had ever seen. The Astartes of the 13th did not mingle with the civilians, and they very rarely stepped foot onto the ships of the estate. They were weapons, the Emperor's own creations, constantly at war, constantly deployed. There was no reason for them to mingle with the estate. This one was always active, talking to militarum commanders, scanning Vox traffic, checking inventories, checking the landers, walking the walls of the compound, climbing the watchtowers, talking to the men on guard, calibrating, testing and firing the automated defences, again and again. He was awake before the conscripts and still going when they turned in for the night. Julius wondered if he ever slept. He was massive, more so to the 10-year-old boy, and impenetrable and silent behind his power armour. Julius so wanted to speak with him, and a day before the attack, a most surprising thing happened. The Astartes spoke to the boy first. Julius was strapping down ammo boxes onto the back of a cargo 8 when the Space Marine came over and started scanning the boxes. The boy immediately stopped what he was doing and just stared. The Space Marine stopped too and looked down at the boy. The boy, who barely came up to his waist, just stared back. "Curious," said the Marine. "The little ones usually run." "What's your name?" asked Julius, staring straight up. The Space Marine made a sound behind his Vox grill. It took a moment for Julius to realise it was laughter. "You're not afraid, are you?" said the Marine. "Never," said Julius, Fear is useless. Even the Emperor protects, or he doesn't. The Marine nodded. My name? They call me Sol Garrow, and you are called Snow. That's what they call me. Why are you back here with us and not fighting? I am new to the 13th. I'm new to the Guard. This is my first big fight. Can you remember your last big fight? I bet it was exciting. Was it exciting? Where was it? It was at, Istvan. The boy screwed up his face thoughtfully. I don't know that place. Did you win? No, we didn't win. Much to my shame. And try as he might, Julius could not get another word out of the big space marine. It took a long time for Julius to get to sleep that night. He was so excited, but when he did, he dreamed of great battles on faraway worlds. He dreamed of heroes, and he dreamed of the Emperor. He dreamed of a place called Istvan. It was a wonderful world, all covered in white snow, where space marines fought aliens, and aliens died, and everyone was laughing and having fun. Istvan, the best battle ever. In the morning he didn't want to wake. The sounds of battle were still ringing in his ears, and it took him a few moments to realize that those sounds were real. The enemy did not come from the sky. They did not ride down in great spacecraft, trailing tails of fire. They did not come across the land, over the snow, tanks and walkers and monster machines. They came from the warp, and they came screaming. The men and women of the 13th put up what fight they could, but it was impossible to form a defensive wall when the enemy appeared inside your lines. The encampment broke apart. Separate battles raged. The tanks began to fire. They fired inside the lines, into the compound. They fired at men, and they fired at monsters. Munitions started to burn. The snow started to boil and steam. Order broke apart within minutes. Terror spread like wildfire. Demons. Demons everywhere. The battle turned into a slaughter. In those opening few moments, there were only two people in the entire encampment that knew no fear. One was a space marine, a knight-errant, chosen of Malkador the Sigillite, and now a sworn brother of the 13th. And the other was a 10-year-old boy. Julius came fully awake to the sounds of panic. He and Kylos were billeted in a prefabricated hablock with the rest of the 2nd 117th. Half of the regiment were already on deployment unloading the landers. The other half were trying to hide under their bunks, or curled up and crying, or running for the exit. The air tasted wrong. Light shone brightly in dark corners, and in others shadows fell where the light should have been. The sounds outside were full of chaos, the literal, raw stuff of chaos. The Voxnet was a panic of voices. Terror hung in the air like a smell. It was real. Death had come, and it had come for them all. Julius jumped out of bed and started screaming. It took a while for Kylos to realize that the boy had not gone mad, that he was actually forming words, that he was screaming words. He was screaming, "Stand and fight! Stand and fight!" over and over until it was not only Kylos that heard the words, but the others in the billet as well. Some even stopped and turned. "Stand and fight! Grab your arms, grab your weapons, stand and fight!" "Why?" one of the troopers yelled back. "We're all going to die." "Then die fighting, die screaming the Emperor's name. Stand and fight, stand and fight." More people in the billet stopped to look. Julius grabbed his las carbine and jumped onto his bunk so everyone could see him. He raised his gun above his head and with his loudest voice he proclaimed, "We are the 13th! We do not bend!" That got their attention, well, most of their attention. Some of them had already fallen to madness and were gibbering in a corner or trying to eat their own shoes, but some stopped to look at the 10-year-old boy, dressed only in his undershorts, jumping up and down on his bunk and waving a gun in the air. Kylos looked at him, this brave young boy trying to rally the conscripts, trying to hold back the fear. "Yes," shouted Kylos, "stand and fight. Grab your guns, grab your gear, let's barricade up the main doors. And the first thing that comes through it, we'll fill it with so many las rounds, we'll boil its blood. Boil its blood and burn it. Burn it back into the warp. That was the tipping point. The conscripts began to move with a kind of purpose. Before long, the doors were barricaded with bunk beds and lockers, and the men and women of the 2nd to 117th were ready to fight. 41 las rifles were pointed at the door. 41 las rifles turned up to maximum charge, full auto, waiting for something, anything, to try and break through the door. On the other side of the compound, Brother Initiate Solgaro knew the battle was lost. Half the camp was on fire, and the casualty rate was at 70% and climbing. The auto turrets had spooled down, and the 4 Lehman Russ battle tanks that he had at his command had been melted to slag. The battle had been raging for 8 minutes. He had called for reinforcements at Mark -5 seconds. Drop reinforcements were incoming and would arrive at Mark +78. That was 5 minutes out, 4 minutes too late. Demons, corn designation red in colour, filled the encampment. Initially, Solgaro had been caught in the melee, fighting furious battles on top of the walls, or by the landers, or inside the compound. But when the battle turned into a slaughter, he fell back to the bunker, an Astartes pattern command module, which was essentially a giant sealed box with 1 meter thick plasteel walls. Inside the command bunker, he looked at the screens. He looked at the armoured door. It was bent and buckling and slowly being battered inwards, but it still held. He looked at the data screens, the incoming drop pod markers, the incoming flight wing markers, the incoming scout biker markers, and other slower reserves. Too slow. Too late. He lifted the seal off the self-destruct system, paused, took one last look at the screens, the data, the timers counting down. Too slow. Too late. He pressed the button. Outside, the world exploded. Inside the bunker, the screens went black, the lights went out, he felt the earth shake a little, and that was all. Seconds later, he cracked open the escape hatch and entered the firestorm. Most of the enemy had been inside the central compound, just in front of the main bunker, and that's where the majority of the charges had been buried. The central compound was now full of craters, rubble, and fire. Secondary explosions were cooking off by the landers as munitions caught fire. More explosions. A ripple of hard rounds going up like firecrackers. No charges had been placed under or near the hab blocks. People were a resource, and it was in that direction Solgaro went. Only those who were in the hab blocks might survive. There were demons out there, very few of them left, and most of them mauled and injured. But there were demons out there, in the fire. Solgaro went through them like a mountain, unstoppable, bolt gun glowing, his power sword fizzing with heat. Then he met the greater demon. It was 3 times his size. It was very injured and very angry. One of its arms was missing, as were its wings and half of its face. But it was angry, and it was 3 times his size, and it was blocking his way. Its back was turned. It would have been easy for Solgaro to unload his gun into its flanks before the demon even knew he was there. But instead, the Astartes called out, "Hey!" The demon turned and roared. Beneath his helmet, Solgaro smiled. "You and me, bitch." The demon surged forward, screaming unholy words, and the fires around it jumped and flared upwards unnaturally. Solgaro went down and underneath it. His sword smashed up between the demon's legs and bit deep, and the demon staggered and then swung round howling, and a crack grenade went off in its face, and a power saw took out one of its kneecaps, and a mass reactive round took out the other kneecap. The demon fell. Solgaro went through the gap in the wall the demon had made, throwing one last grenade back over his shoulder. Inside, the first room was an abattoir of body parts. He moved through the space without slowing. Then through another. Everyone was dead, just as the men on the walls had died, slain during the fighting or killed when the demolitions exploded. It looked like everyone, billeted in the habs, had been slaughtered as well. Then he came to the blocked door. His helmet registered heat signatures on the other side. Someone might be alive. He pushed at the door and it gave a little, the barricade at the other side creaking but holding firm. He took a few steps back and then just ran forward, aiming for the wall beside the door. The prefab wall didn't even slow him and he went straight through it. On the other side of the wall, another slaughterhouse. Body parts covered the floor, covered the walls, and in the middle sat a boy covered head to toe in red blood, and in his arms lay a man also covered in blood. They were both breathing. The boy's life signs were strong. The man's life signs, not so much. The boy looked up at the Space Marine. His eyes were fierce and hard. He was not scared. He had not been crying. "They appeared out of the air," said the boy. "They appeared inside the room, inside the barricade. We killed as many as we could." Solgaro nodded. "I'm sure you did." In his arms, the dying man stirred, tried to sit up. There were wounds across his legs and belly and face where he had been clawed at, where he had been bitten at. "Julius tried to save us." "The boy tried," Kylos gurgled. "He's a hero. He deserves his place on the Eagle Remembers. That's what I've been trying to tell you people all this time. He needs his family." "You are my family," said Julius. "Real family," Kylos wheezed. Real. And then Kylos, the guild worker, the tub docker, died. Slowly Julius lowered him down, and he did not cry. He did not sob. "But there's no one left," said the boy, staring around the room. "The only true family you ever have is the family forged in war, a brotherhood of warriors, those who will fight for you, die for you." He looked up at the Space Marine. "And everyone I have ever fought with is dead." Solgaro turned his head and listened. Short-range Vox hails filled his helmet. Bleeps, clicks. Reinforcements had arrived. "I lost a family once," said Solgaro, standing. "But I found another." He held out his hand to the boy. "Come with me, Snow," he said, "and I am sure that one day I will call you my brother."
Part 5. The Death of Vengeance.
So the 13th Fleet now consists of around 200 ships, while the majority of these ships are civilian. Over 50 are warships, the ships of the line, and most of these are small frigates, corvettes, and defense monitors. Of the big ships, there are 2 capital ships. They are Apocalypse-class battleships, the Invincible and the Defiant. But there was a third battleship, Jupiter-class, 3 kilometers smaller than its cousins, but still 10 kilometers in length, and still a planet killer. She was called Vengeance. She served the fleet for 1,000 years and the wider Imperium for 3,000 before that. Originally indentured to the Segmentum Pacificus of the Imperial Navy, she was severely crippled in the Gacentus uprising and fled the line. Her reactor was breached and all hands abandoned ship. The 13th came through the sector over a decade later, mopping up, helping survivors, and found the Vengeance adrift by the outer planets. She was scarred and irradiated, but not beyond salvaging. Why she had been left hanging in space, no one knew. Maybe the Imperium could not sacrifice the manpower to recover her at the time, or maybe the salvage crew had come to a grisly end. Maybe they just did not know she was there. The Imperium information machine is Byzantine and unreliable. Rumors circulated that she was a bad star, an unlucky find. But the 13th spent years piecing her back together and rad-scouring the hull, and then pressed her into service. In M41-700, the Tau discovered the ZFR Horizon Accelerator engine and began their second sphere of expansion. When they crossed the Damocles Gulf, they came into contact with the Imperium for the first time, and it was in the Saslau system, a small and unremarked spot on the northern frontier, where the Tau met the 13th. The 13th were berthed in deep orbit around Saslau 4. It was, up until this point, a quiet area of space, which is exactly why the 13th were there. Most of the ships of the line had left to help the survivors and leftovers from the war between the Imperium and the Tau, and when the Imperium moved through a sector, they'd simply steamrolled over everything in their path and then kept moving, regularly leaving pockets of humans and Xenos behind. Micro-battles had erupted on ruined worlds in ruined cities. It was these fights where the 13th could prove most useful, mopping up where the Imperium did not care to be, saving the last human colonists on a world, the last research stations, the last deep space outposts. It was the kind of war the 13th excelled at, and the kind of war where the 13th could find new aspirants, new recruits. While this war was being prosecuted by the 13th, while the war machine was away, the ships of the estate were anchored in deep orbit above Saslau 4, a broad scattering of civilian ships and of various sizes, from the small to the massive, from packet ships and gun cutters, all the way up to bulk haulers, conveyors and mass transports. Guarding them was a ring of defense monitors, slowly moving, poor-shielded gun forts, and over a dozen warships, the ships of the line that were not off prosecuting war. These were on picket duty. Heading up the defence was the two destroyers, the Invincible and the Vengeance. The Tau entered the system at an angle 90 degrees up from the lateral plane. As Tau do not use warp drive, they had no need to enter the system from the Mandeville point. Such Imperium designations meant nothing to them. Trillions of kilometers away, the 13th saw them coming. The deep field auspex lit up, a vast armada of moving dots, heat signatures, and gravity displacements, all moving at a terrific rate. At this distance, it would be 4 days before the visual auspex contact and 5 days before the Void War began. But even at this distance, it was clear that the 13th were massively outnumbered. There was only one choice for the 13th Fleet. They fled. Using Saslau as a slingshot, they powered up real space drives and ran for the Mandeville point. The battleships were able to tether one defense monitor each, and the rest were left to make their own way out, never to be seen again. Void War is all about timing. Distances are vast, and speeds are relative. If one warship was travelling 0.003 to the speed of light, and so was the target, they could appear stationary to each other if travelling on the same vector, or they could pass each other in a nanosecond if on different trajectories. It was all about timing, movement, distance. It was a dance. It was a ballet. And as the 13th closed on the Mandeville point, and as the entire Tau fleet changed course to intercept, and as the hours counted down, it became clear that the 13th would run out of time. Someone had to make a sacrifice for the greater good, to allow the rest of the fleet to escape. And it was the Vengeance that made that sacrifice. An hour before the jump point and 30 minutes before contact, the Vengeance broke formation and angled up off the plane of advance, putting 10 kilometers of guns, adamantium and reinforced ceramite between the Tau and the rest of the fleet. Shields raised. The Tau came on. At this range, it became clear that the Vengeance was much, much, much bigger than anything the Tau had to offer. She was a behemoth, a monster from the deep. The new Xenos race had just started their war with the Imperium and had not adapted yet. However, the Tau guns were formidable. They had range and they had strength in numbers. The void lit up. The Tau guns hit the Vengeance, and she ran on into the fire. 1,000 missiles and energy beams from 1,000 different directions poured into the destroyer, lighting her shields from prow to stern. It was like throwing fuel on a candle. The dark of space was suddenly lit brightly, and the Tau paused, certain in their kill. And then the Vengeance came powering through the fire, unscathed, untouched, her shield strong and her throat roaring. She shouted missiles and torpedoes in all directions, still too far out for lance weaponry. A dozen Tau craft simply ceased to exist before the Tau fully recovered and altered their attack. The second volley of fire was altogether different. Xenos tech, pulsing, modulated fire. It rippled over the Vengeance in waves, thrumming at the shields, bouncing and stretching them. Beneath the shields, the Vengeance shook and vibrated, boomed and creaked as waves of pressure overwhelmed the motive systems, and then, inevitably, the shields collapsed. But by this time, the Tau were in range of her bellicose macro cannons. She drew in her breath and fired. During the second sphere of expansion, the Tau possessed elegant technology and powerful, long-range guns, but capital ship macro cannons were forged at a time when the Tau were huddling in caves and drawing on walls. They were forged by machine minds who meant to use them to take the galaxy. They were forged to cut through fortress moons. The first shot tore through 3 Tau warships, one after the other. The second shot took out 4. Then the rest of her guns lit up the void. With her shields overloaded, the Vengeance diverted all power to all of her guns. All of them. Nova cannons, fusion beamers, lance weaponry fired from every deck at 100 different targets. The Tau had poked a beast, and the beast was very, very angry. Like a firework exploding in the night sky, the Tau fleet but diverted in every direction, 1,000 tiny lights. It was beautiful. This was exactly what the 13th had planned. While the Vengeance drew more power to her guns and launched waves of fighter wings and boarding craft, the Tau were in disarray, and the remainder of the fleet made it to the jump point unmolested. Then the Vengeance burned hard, forcing a wide turn, and raced for the Mandible Point herself, without shields, exposing her sides and weak rear armor. The Tau warships were frighteningly agile and came about like a pack of wild dogs, yapping at her heels. Xenos guns, Tau guns, blew holes out of her plating. Thrusters were damaged, overloaded, shut down. Ion cannons and Void Seeker missiles stabbed into her again and again, but she would not die easy. She fought and roared every inch of the way. Then a large Tau craft, pattern unknown, flew across her port side and fired round after round, red, powerful, ugly weaponry. All of her side plates were ripped away, and then swarms of rockets dug deep beneath the flesh and exploded inside her guts. The whole ship bent in pain and started to spin about itself. And then she made the jump point, and then she jumped. The rest of the 13th Fleet, after taking a short jump through the warp, waited for her out in the black in deep space. 30 minutes later the Vengeance appeared. She was all but a ruin. While the Gellerfield had somehow held together through the warp, much of the rest of her had not. When she translated into real space, her reactor core was dead and ejected, and all primary thrust lost. Her entire left side had been gouged out down to the core superstructure, and she had been pierced right through again and again, as someone might stick a needle through bread, by hyper-powerful railgun weaponry. The 13th learned much in that battle. So did the Tau. 102,000 souls had been on board the Vengeance, and in less than 20 minutes, 89% of them had died. Over 600 Astartes were lost forever. Many had never left the hangars or teleportariums. The Vengeance was dead, but in death, she could still serve. Most warp-capable craft, when as battered as the Vengeance had been, were returned to a shipyard to be blessed and rebuilt. The 13th had no such resources when they lost a ship, even as one as great as the Vengeance. They cannibalized it for scraps. She became a fabricator ship. Environmental controls were re-established and a city was born inside her. Workshops and manufactorums were set up, to slowly hollow her out from the inside. Her corpse would be used to make anything and everything, from armoured plating to machine parts to bullets and bottles. She was renamed FS-117, the 117th fabricator ship of the 13th Fleet. It was into this world that Sagan Mir was born. His father and mother were part of the 10,000-strong work crew that helped slowly dismantle FS-117. Servitors did much of the hard labour. Engineers mapped and planned the process. The human work crew dismantled the larger pieces that were brought into the work bays by the servitors. They sorted and categorized all the parts. His mother was a line worker. His father an oil man and worked with greases, oils, coolants and fluids. By the time Sagan was 3, his mother knew he was different. By the time Sagan was 7 or 8, all the mothers knew, and the other children stopped playing with him. But that was okay. By that time he had started work too. There was a scolum in the empty halls of FS-117, which he went to for 4 hours a day, where he sat in the corner on his own, and no one ever looked at him. And when not at school, he could be found separating nuts from bolts, or wire from the inside of plastic cabling. As Sagan worked or schooled, he would see things in the shadows, and when his mood was most foul, he would see things in the light. He would hear voices, and sometimes he would speak back to them. Never a wise thing to do when an adult was around, but to the boy, Sagan, it seemed natural. He knew no other kind of existence. He did not manifest any powers back then, no lightning bolts or flashy pyrotechnics, just voices and shapes and things in the corner of his eyes. However, he did remember feeling permanently afraid. He remembered thinking the ship, the walls, the deck plates, the places he inhabited were cursed and full of ghosts. He knew it was an unlucky ship, a bad star. When he was 9, a new lineman was put in charge of their section, and things started to go wrong straight away. His name was Faust, and he was an angry, violent man. Sagan was terrified of him. His parents talked in hushed whispers whenever Faust was near, and one day he heard his father whispering about missing workers, lots of missing workers. Then one day, Faust and his men came for Sagan's mother. It was late. Sagan was awake. The blackness was talking to him again, talking of murder and skulls. He ignored the voices, as he always did, hoping they would go away, as they always did, but on this occasion they just got louder and louder, until Sagan screamed out and ran to his mother. He reached her just as the door to their room came swinging in, kicked open, and 4 large, brutish men entered the room. One of them was Faust. There was shouting and violence. A man grabbed his mother by the hair and started to drag her from the room. His father attacked. There was blood and noise, and Sagan curled up in the corner and trying to ignore the voices. The voices told him his father was going to die. The voices laughed at him. Faust smashed his father to the floor. "How dare you attack my men?" he screamed. "Leave my wife," said Sagan's father. "Leave my wife." "I want to hear you beg, little man. Please, just don't hurt my wife." "Good enough." Then Faust stabbed his father in the neck with something sharp. The air turned red. The walls turned red. Blood pooled across the floor. The voices in the shadows were laughing and laughing. And Faust and his men turned and left, leaving Sagan and his mother behind, cradling her dead husband. Things changed pretty rapidly after his father had died. Sagan's mother was called Terzi. She had always been a fierce and intelligent woman, but after that night, she became something else. Terzi Mir became a leader. All over the creaking and peeling hull of FS-117 there were other families and other victims of Faust and his men. Stories of violence began to emerge. Some individuals had gone to the engineers to complain. Maybe Faust had been disciplined, maybe not, but Faust certainly made it worse for those that complained. And some of those that had complained had died, rather suddenly. A collapsing beam here, a malfunctioning airlock there. One person had boiled inside his compressor suit while floating outside in the black. Tercy found them all. She spoke to them all and began to form a plan. It was at this time that she began to ask Sagan for advice. While he was only 9 years old, she knew his instincts, his foresight was a gift. He always seemed to know which way the coin would land. So she asked him now whether he thought the people they met were good people or bad people, whether they could be trusted or whether they were liars and cowards. Simple questions for a little boy, innocent. And Sagan would happily answer each question, although he never told his mother where he was getting his answers. They came from the faces in the shadows and from the voices in the dark, and sometimes the voices in the light. That way, Tercy was able to pull together a group of like-minded people, and they in turn were able to reach out to the few others they trusted. There were secret meetings. Some people wanted to get the engineers involved. Others wanted to get a distress message off ship to the Astartes of the 13th. The group became groups of people, each with their own grievances, each with their own stories. It was in this way that Tercy heard about the Hanging Gardens, and one night she and Sagan found their way there. It was down in the bilge decks where the air was moist and hot and the ship creaked alarmingly. This was a place of metal catwalks, thick cabling and bulkheads and weak sodium lights. It was a place of water and fumes, full of trapdoors and backdoors and crawl spaces and dead ends. It was narrow and dark, and yet, in certain places, wide open and lonely. There were forgotten spaces down there in the black, empty hangars, silos full of chains and rust, deep shafts that dropped into nothing. And in one of these empty spaces, the Hanging Gardens. Sagan's head was ringing long before they got there. The voices in the shadows told him to go back. They told him of murder in the dark. He tried to warn his mother, but she was so fierce and so determined. Nothing could stop her when her mind was set. And so, in a wide open hangar, deep, deep under the bilge decks, where the gravity was heavy and the lights were dark, they found the Hanging Gardens. Sagan could remember very little of it. Bodies dangled from wires, hundreds of them. The smell of it, so thick you could taste it. But what he most remembered was the symbols scratched into the walls, into the floor, into the bodies. That was the first time he saw pure chaos with his own eyes. He remembered vomiting and screaming and screaming. He remembered his mother dragging him away and trying anything and everything to make him calm down, and, more importantly, to try and stop him making so much noise. She tried pleading with him, slapping him, smothering him, but he could not stop. He would not stop. He felt sick to his core, and he remembered the faces in the shadows were laughing and laughing at him, brutish, ugly sounds. It sounded like the laughter of thirsting gods. So much noise was bound to attract attention. His mother was dragging him and dragging him back through the narrow spaces as his screams echoed everywhere. Then men appeared and kicked Sagan to the floor. They laughed at him. Or was it the shadows laughing? He remembered blood. He remembered his mother screaming. He remembered Faust's face pressed up against hers. He remembered the laughter. "I want to hear you beg, little man." Sagan pissed his pants. The shadows laughed at him. "Good enough." Then there was an explosion of light. Drawn by the noise, another group of people had come, line workers and manufactorum serfs, spilling down through the corridors. They came roaring and chanting with weapons in their hands, waving bulk lights and hefting hammers and spanners and arc tools. Faust and his men dropped Sagan to the floor and disappeared into the ship. His head began to clear. His eyes began to clear, and he could stand and look around. He realized how close he was to the central manufactorum, just how far his mother had dragged him. His mother was nearby, shaking and crying, and a crowd of people pressed around them. Others ran off into the dark to look for Faust and his men. The line workers from the manufactorum saved them both that night, and in return, Tercy Mir saved them all. Over the next few days, the fight back began. The workers of FS 117 began to organize themselves and began to rebel against Faust and the other linemen, all under the leadership of Tercy Mir. What started as a simple protest against Faust, against one lineman, snowballed into a protest against them all. Within a few short days, all the workers on FS-117 had thrown down their tools, and more stories of abuse, abductions, mistreatment, and murder quickly surfaced, and the story of the Hanging Gardens circulated. It became apparent that FS-117 was rotten to the core, a bad star. And the dividing lines were not that clear. Some linemen joined the workers. A good chunk of the workers joined Faust and his henchmen. After 4 days, the first acts of violence broke out, and then it just got worse. Faust and his followers held the keys to the kingdom. They could open any lock, and they knew where to look. And FS-117 had once been a battleship. They found guns and armor and grenades, and one morning, on day 7, they used them. By the evening of day 7, over 1,000 people were dead, and all-out war had spread throughout the ship. The war ended in Hangar 16B. That was when the Astartes of the 13th intervened. Tercy Mir and her core supporters had been driven back into the hangar by a screaming mob of men with guns and blades and blood in their eyes. As ever, Sagan was with his mother. He had barely left her side. Tercy's followers were spread throughout the vast expanse of the hangar. The hangar was a chop shop full of broken machine parts, and crouching in the rubble were groups of line workers. Some had firearms, most carried improvised weapons of some sort. Faust and his men were pushing through the only functioning entrance, a wide rail tunnel, large enough for the brute hall servitors. Las rounds flashed. Smoke filled the air. Then, very suddenly, Space Marines teleported into the fight. They materialized between the two warring forces, massive Terminators in colours of the 13th. There were dozens of them, and in their midst, all in black, the unmistakable figure of Chaplain Lucius Snow. A few stray rounds bounced off Terminator plate, and then the fighting immediately stopped. The hangar, which had previously been a riot of noise and flashes and screams, was suddenly very quiet. The Astartes did not raise their weapons. They did not need to. Chaplain Snow walked to the front of his men and pointed. He knew exactly where to look and who to look for. "Come here." Faust came forward, shuffling, sniffling, head bowed. Then Snow beckoned to Tercy, who also came forward, her eyes fierce. Sagan Mir came with her, hanging in the shadows. He didn't know where else to be. "You have broken your oaths," said Snow. "You have killed brothers. You have poisoned the fleet." He grabbed Faust about the head, his black gauntlet covering half of the man's face. Faust struggled and went to lift his las carbine. Snow squeezed, and Faust dropped his gun and froze in fear. Snow looked at Tercy. "How do you want this to end?" She said, "I want to hear him beg." Snow looked down at the tiny mortal and gave him a shake. Faust whimpered. "Good enough," said Tercy. Snow nodded and closed his fist. Faust's skull crumpled. "Kill the traitors," said Snow, and the Terminators opened fire. The linemen and workers that had sided with Faust were exterminated. The loyalists were ferried off FS-117 and back to the bulk of the fleet. They were vetted for signs of deviancy and chaos taint. It was during this process that the Astartes of the 13th discovered that Sagan had a gift, and he was inducted into the Astartes selection process. As for Fabricator Ship 117, previously the battleship Vengeance, well, she was towed out of the line to the nearest star. A bad star. A fat, bloated red giant. There a mindless servitor tug pushed her towards the furnace and to her doom.
Part 6. Chapter Master.
He looked down at his hands, old now. Once they were full of light, but they were old now, lined with age, scarred by war. He could not remember a time without war, only war. Solgaro looked across the battlefield. It was grey and dead and cold. Ranks of armour lay broken in the field. Lines of razor wire chinked in the breeze, and bodies. There were bodies everywhere, very few of them whole. This had been his work. This was his victory. It didn't feel like a victory. Behind him reared the fortress walls, black cliffs reaching all the way to the stars. A breach, had broken the walls in two, wide enough for a tank and filled with bodies. Thousands of bodies. Mutants and cultists, broken and cold. Atop a mound of corpses in the centre of the breach, a single banner hung limply. A banner of the 13th. He remembered his men fighting around him, dying around him, the crash of explosions, the scream of flamers, hard rounds pinging from his armour. He remembered the last charge of Garrod's platoon, the last of the Militarum. More of a stumbling run, really, the ground was so uneven. Garrod pushed the enemy back for a moment, allowing the 13th Astartes to regroup. That moment had given them 10 more minutes, was only 10 minutes. It had felt like 10 years. 10 years in the breach until only he and Dersius had remained. Brave Dersius, laughing as he killed. A great last stand, Dersius had said, his chainsword whirring around him. One for the Hall of Records, they'll make you chapter master for this. Then a mining laser had cut Dersius in two, and he finally stopped laughing. So Garrod had fought on. That was all he could do. That was all he ever did. Solgara looked back towards the banner of the 13th standing lonely in the breach, the pole jammed through the gut of a dead warrior, the cloth barely moving in the breeze. It was so thick with blood, so much blood. He wondered if they had heard his call. Had anyone? His helmet had been ripped from his head so long ago, thousands of years ago. Perhaps he was the last, again, the last Astartes, the last Space Marine. 48 hours earlier, Solgaro had entered the stratagem and was surprised by what he found there. Usually the stratagem was filled with field commandos for the upcoming mission and the field commanders only. Half a dozen souls at most. It was the last conclave before the drop, and that was how it was done. Not this time. This time they were all there. Sagan Mir, Tractatus, and a number of the librarians off to one side. Captain Morsus pacing back and forth as he always did. Gabriel Locke, his friend, looked stern, angry even, staring across the stratagem table at Captain Talus. Talus was second generation Primaris, and Krieger, Thule, Ridley, and other second generation stood with him. Funny how they always seemed to move together. The fact that Chaplain Snow was there would have been surprising on its own. He never came to these things. Snow did not mix well with others. No, what was most surprising was that two ancient brothers also shared the stratagem. Callias Tomb, Chaplain Dreadnought, hero of the Galmec incident, and ancient brother Matthias, the best of them, a huge and immobile shadow at the back of the room, watching, listening, patient. Solgaro knew that Matthias would hate being there. He hated anything but war. The stratagem was a large room of cogitators and hololiths. The table in the middle was lit with a 3D display of the target zone. Blips moved across it. It changed in real time. Typically the room would be alive with noise as the latest comms came through, but the channels had been muted and the machine spirits silenced. They did not like being silenced. The spirits burped and grumbled in the background like angry children. Lights flashed for attention. "You're late," growled Snow. "I was with the Militarum," said Solgaro as he entered, "prepping for the drop." "See," said Captain Talus. "That's why it should be him." Talus was tall. All the Primaris were tall, but he looked taller still in his sleek Phobos battle plate. He was an easy man to like, not only for his battle honours, but because he smiled often. He was optimistic, something of a rarity in the 13th. "We need a chapter master," said Talus. "We've had this conversation," said Solgaro. "All of us, many times." "But there is consensus now," said Sagan Mir quietly. So that was why they had come, thought Solgaro. Still, it begged the question. "Before a drop?" he asked. "Regardless of consensus, this is not the time." "It is exactly the time," said Talus. "If there was a chapter master, a unifying force before the shattering, before the death of hope, before a dozen other war zones, things would have been different." Subjective, said Solgaro. You posit our interconnectedness is a weakness. I say it is a strength. A number of other officers nodded at this. Solgaro marked them. It was clear that some consented, but not all. Gabriel Locke looked angry, and Snow always looked angry. Then Talus spoke. They say you're the oldest, so I say it should be you. He pointed to the hulking form of Matthias at the back of the room. Even our ancient brother here defers to you, though I don't know why. Matthias said nothing, watching, listening. The 13th have no master, said Solgaro. Manus was the first and last. There is no process by which to elevate someone, and we should not create one. We could, whispered Sagan Mir. Make one. Or we could ask the Primarch, said Talus. No, said Matthias loudly through his box speaker. We do not concern the Lord Commander with petty affairs of rank. We follow and we thank him for it. Think on your hubris, Captain Talus. Talus bowed. Of course, he said. We've been round this circle before, said Solgaro, and we circle it again. It should be put to rest. Then agree, said Talus simply. Astartes should be led by a chapter master. It is written in the Codex. It is how we function. It is how we fight. Not always was it so, said Solgaro, looking across at the first-generation Marines, those that knew his story. And the 13th are more than Astartes. We're a fleet, putting thoughts of mortals to one side, which is onerous in itself, but putting thoughts of them to one side, the 13th were founded as equals from many different chapters, from many different creeds, and, over time, from many different ages. We stand apart and we stand stronger for it. The center cannot be broken because there is no center. We can shatter and be remade. We can lose hope. We can lose wars, men and machines, and we can break. We have broken, but we do not bend. Not one of us bends, not now and not ever. Sagan Mir nodded solemnly. You're a fine man, he said. That's why it must be you. Solgaro shook his head and looked across the table at Chaplain Snow. Snow glared back. You've been quiet, my friend, said Solgaro. What do you say? He's right, you know, hissed Snow. And you made his case stronger with your pretty words, but he's right. We need to put this behind us once and for all. You agree with him? I don't care, growled the chaplain, but we must put this behind us. And how do we do that? Asked Solgaro. Simple, said Snow. We're Astartes. We fight. 48 hours later, a Thunderhawk with Storm Talon escorts dropped down from the clouds towards the fortress. The fortress was a massive thing, the size of a small city, and the 13th had deployed in force to hold the front and break the cultists against the gates. The front had held. The front had held easily because that was not where the main attack had come. The main attack had come from the rear. No one had predicted it because no one believed the cultists had the strength to breach the rear walls. They had never been breached, not since the fortress was raised 3,000 years earlier. The walls were too high, too strong, too impossible to bring down, but the cultists had brought them down. They were miners after all. They must have dug through sheer granite and packed the tunnels with enough explosives to crack open a titan. Whatever they had done, it had worked, and a gap had opened up in the impossible walls. Inside the Thunderhawk, Captain Talus prepared his men for combat insurgent. It would be hot and they knew it. Though a flight of storm talons followed him down, he wondered if he had enough gun. The walls had been breached, and so the fortress would fall. He was sure of it. They all were. After the walls had fallen, the tactical auspex had lit up and the battlesphere had changed. There were suddenly thousands of contacts out in the wastes, streaming towards the breach. The perfect ambush. Before the battle, he knew that Solgaro had been roving inside the fortress with a strike force of Astartes and 10 platoons of the 13th Militarum, waiting to respond to a surprise attack. Others had questioned his actions. Talus had thought it was a waste of resource. There could be no more surprises. There had been enough surprises. The cultists had played all their cards and played them well, which is why the 13th had retreated to the fortress. But when the walls were breached, Solgaro and his company had raced to fill it. He had been right to hold on to a mobile reserve, as though he had seen something no one else had seen, like a chapter master, thought Tallis. But one company against thousands? They could not hold the breach. No one could hold the breach. When Tallis gathered his fast response team and first boxed through to Solgaro, all he could hear was a wall of noise and war. He needed data, dispositions and armament so he could select the right tools for the job, but nothing could be heard except chaos. Solgaro had not responded. A chopped message from a Militarum sergeant was cut short, and then identifiers began to wink out. Battle codes were scrambled and high-sat images became a blur as smoke and heat filled the target zone. Tallis tried the comms again. Nothing. Dead air. "Captain," called the tech marine pilot, "you'd better take a look at this." Tallis left his men and came to the cockpit as the Thunderhawk banked for its final approach. He looked down, expecting to see a maelstrom of enemy machines and infantry streaming through the breach in the walls. Instead, he saw a graveyard, broken vehicles, bodies, and steaming craters stretched away from the walls. Apart from the smoke and patches of flame, it was very still. Nothing was moving. The Thunderhawk touched down. Overhead, talons zipped by, chasing for targets that were not there. The Thunderhawk, still creaking with the heat of re-entry, blew its bolts and ramps thumped down, and Marines came quickly out. Combat spread, guns switching right and left, Auspex singing. Captain Tallis ran down the front ramp and stared at the breach in the walls. A jagged cut and mounds of rubble and bodies filled the breach, and in the centre, standing on its own, a banner of the 13th. It was riddled with bullet holes and dripping blood, yet still it stood. Immovable. He felt pride stir in his chest, but also caution. Had the enemy put it there? Was this another trap? Behind the standard, from out of the black, a lone space marine climbed into the light. He moved slowly, purposefully, as though he was old beyond measure or perhaps worn thin by endless war, only war. His helmet was missing and his armor was in ruins, but still he stood by the banner, a power sword fizzing in his fist, a burning blade. Tallis dropped to one knee. "Master," he said. "Get up, Captain," said Solgaro. "There are no masters here, only the honored dead." Tallis stood and looked around him at the butchery and devastation. He counted loyalist Militarum and Astartes amongst the corpses, but so few compared to the ranks of the enemy, now broken and beaten beneath the impossible walls. "How many made it through?" he asked. "None. We held." "How many Marines stand with you?" "None. I am the last Space Marine." 1 week later, in the primary hangar of the battleship Defiant, the question that Tallis had sought an answer, whether there should be a chapter master at the 13th, would finally be decided. The hangar bay was full, beyond full, rammed with Astartes, Militarum, Navy troopers and ratings, and even important civilians from the estate. Pic cameras were set up to broadcast the occasion. Matthias had decreed that there should be as many witnesses as possible, and that it should happen in the hangar where as many of them could fit, and his wisdom, as ever, was never questioned. So the hangar bay was emptied of its armor and machines of war, and filled with tens of thousands of chattering souls, staring down at the combat arena in the center. A square had been marked out, 13 meters by 13, and in it, 2 warriors would fight to determine the future of the 13th. Snow had suggested the format. Agreement had been reached. Rules had been set. A duel. If Tallis won, then the 13th would nominate a chapter master. If Solgaro won, there would be no chapter master. Not now, not ever. They would fight until the other submitted or could not continue. Be that unconsciousness or trauma. Simple rules. Snow liked simple rules. However, as no one could envisage a scenario where one of them would back down and submit, Everyone thought it would be a long and bloody fight, finished with trauma, finished with blood loss. And then objections had arisen. A day before the fight, the objections grew louder amongst the civilians and consumed the fleet. Money stopped changing hands. Fights broke out among the civilians. The Astartes ignored it until a man was killed. A civilian on the face of the sea. His name had been Dengle. He had left behind 3 young children who he cared for, who depended on him. He had waged Solgara would lose in the first 60 seconds. These bets were getting wiped, early losses. There was a growing feeling amongst the civilians that Solgaro would throw the fight. That evening, with 9 hours to go, the Astartes changed the combatants, and peace was quickly restored. And so it was that Solgaro stood in full armour in the fighting square next to his old friend, Chaplain Snow. Chaplain Snow was stripped down to a body glove and held a gladius in his hand. He held the sword the wrong way, pommel up, and blade down, as if he did not know what to do with it. In fairness, he had not held a gladius for the best part of 100 years. Solgaro shook his head. Again. "You're a fool, Julius," he said. "It had to be me," said Snow angrily. "No one would believe I could throw a fight. And no one should think I could throw one either." "Forgive them their sins," said Snow. "They are mortal and full of doubts. This was not about them." "It's always about them," said Snow. "Astartes exist because there is an Imperium. The 13th exist because there is a fleet." Did you rehearse that one?" smiled Solgaro. Snow snarled. His colourful response was drowned in noise as a second figure entered the fighting square and the crowd cheered, brayed and stamped their feet. Captain Talus, Primaris, 2nd generation, was also stripped to his body glove and swung a gladius through the air like he knew how to use it, like he had been practicing. He rolled his neck, stretched his legs, swung the gladius some more. Solgaro shook his head, again, knowing full well that the captain had no need to warm his muscles or stretch his tendons. He was Astartes. He was always ready for war. "He's a big lad," growled Snow. "You're going to lose," said Solgaro. "He's Primaris. He's faster, bigger, stronger." Snow grinned. "I've got 400 years of experience on that boy." "Younger," said Solgaro. "You're old, you know. Really old." Snow laughed. "A rare thing." "Thanks. A bit of anger always helps." "You're always angry," said Solgaro, "and stubborn. Neither of those things will help you now, not one-on-one. How on Terra do you think you can beat him?" "Easy," growled Snow, patting his old friend on the arm. "I fight dirty." A klaxon sounded and the crowd quietened. Words were spoken from Talus and Solgaro, and a few mortals had been given time for speeches. The rules of the fight were repeated. There would be no bouts or rounds. There would be no rest until one submitted or could fight no longer. All understood and agreed to the risks. Then a second klaxon sounded, and the fight began. What should have happened, and what usually happened when 2 Astartes duelled with each other, was not what happened here. Usually there would be a testing out period, lunges and feints as each swordsman got the measure of the other. It could be minutes before the true fight began. Instead, Chaplain Snow fought dirty. When the second klaxon sounded, Snow raced across the fighting square and launched himself at Talus. Talus could have stepped out of the way, but he saw an opening and he took it. Snow was not adequately defending himself, and so Talus swung his gladius and met the onrushing chaplain. His gladius thumped solidly into Snow's side. The reinforced fused ribcage of an Astartes is incredibly tough. Snow took the force of the blow against his ribs as the gladius struck solid into the bone, and he did not stop moving straight into the captain. His sword arm came up, pommel first, and smashed Talus straight in the groin. At full swing. Full transhuman swing. At the same time, he lunged forward and his forehead smashed into the captain's nose. It broke with a crack and a flash of blood. The captain fell back, snow on top of him. The back of the captain's head cracked off the reinforced deck plates. Snow kept pounding, butting, as fast as an Astartes could. It was over in 3 seconds. It took the apothecaries another 10 seconds to pull Snow away. In the years that followed, when asked about the fight in the hangar bay, Snow would grunt and ignore any questions. However, if someone had the guts to say to him that it was not a fair fight, an honourable fight, he would often reply, "I cracked him in the balls with a pommel. I could have used the sharp end." When Talus awoke in the apothecarium, hours had passed. His cranium, nose, and cheekbones had been stitched back together using synthetic bone fibers. His accelerated physiology would take care of the rest. There was a thick headache, a lump between the eyes that pain suppressants could not fill. His arms felt heavy, his body felt heavy, and his legs would not move. Around him, machines beeped and purred. Beneath it all, he could feel a deep engine thrum, the heart of the battleship, pulsing slowly. "I lost," he said to himself. A face looked down at him, a strong, battle-worn face. It took him longer than he would have liked to realize it was Captain Ridley, Primaris. "Never fight a chaplain," said Ridley. "So much faith and fury in them. They do like to vent it on others." "I lost," said Talus. "The 13th lost. Lost their way." "I think they follow their own path," said Ridley. "There is one path," said Talus. "All other paths lead to heresy, betrayal, the end of empires. You should rest. Find yourself again." "They were renegades, Ridley. Did you know that? Even the Inquisition hunted them." "That was before Guilliman," said Ridley. "And with a word all was forgiven," said Talus. "The impure made pure with a word. No, it runs deep in them, like a cancer. It festers still." "You're confused," said Ridley. "You should rest." Buttons were pressed and chemicals saturated the captain's body. His mind turned grey. Talus faded. "Impure," he whispered. "A cancer. Deep. I shall cut it out." Part 7. Ambush. Co-written with Joshua Edwards.
The war was over, and the Hendris system was on fire. No one had won. Stories would not be written about the war, and the rest of the galaxy would not know what had happened here. Yes, some commanders and warlords had declared victory, and yes, heroes had fought and died. But no one had won. Ships drifted in the void, piecemeal, trailing plumes and bits of themselves. Repair crews worked overtime while deep field ore-specs peered nervously into the deep. In this way the system emptied, bit by bit, like breath from a dying body. Some made it out unmolested. Some never made it out at all. From the Mandeville Point, a ship might leave the Hendris system for a distant shore or for refit at Gehenna if the shipyards there were still worthy. Heretics would go where heretics would go, darker places no doubt, but some, the mauled and the broken, could not get far without dropping out of the warp for further repair. And so they waited a short jump away, close to the corona of a nameless star. 3 planets in the system had once been inhabited, but now only one held life. Aranta, Dirtball, Dustball, Dead End. No one came to Aranta. There was nothing to pillage or trade. The Imperium had taken it millennia before. No one came to Aranta except to hide. So they waited in the black, waited and watched for weeks and weeks. They were the 13th. They had done this before. Core Draxus lay dormant on the medicae of the enlightened truth, his breathing obscured by the whirring and beeping of ancient life support systems. What counted as the warband's apothecaries and medicae servitors filled him with fluids and stuck his flesh with needles. Priests stood around him, chanting prayers and bartering with the dark gods. Incense filled the air and minor demons danced in and out of reality, some woeful, most spiteful. He would wake, he would be strong again, but it would take time. The Hendris campaign had taken its toll. Drakmor, master of possession, stood over his lord and shook his head. Gulliman's damned lapdogs, he spat. The Ultramarines had got the drop on them as they had left the dying system. They had taken as much from the Loyalists as they had given, but it had not been easy. Cordraxis barely made it out alive. Lesser men than Drakmor would have seen his lord's condition as an opportunity to seize power. Lesser men than Drakmor would have found Gordraxus bleeding and broken and ended his life on the battlefield, the maelstrom of war, a perfect place for betrayal. But regicide is best left to the 8th Legion. Instead, Drakmor had heaved his master's prone body off-world, for he had faith that Gordraxus would lead them to greater glory. Any improvement, Portus? He is stable and he is healing. He will live. Drakmor nodded. Rest well, the sorcerer said to his master. The perpetual spiral will endure in your absence. On the bridge, warpsmith Harrick studied the blip on the auspex. It was faint and far away, but he saw it. He instructed his scry skulls to overclock the scanners, enhancing the visual feed as much as he could. When he saw the feed, he grunted. What is it, Harrick? Quizzed Drakmor, walking back onto the bridge. Loyalists, the warpsmith growled. Which loyalists? The 13th. More sons of Ultramar? Not the 13th Legion, boy, said Harrick, scowling. The 13th. Drakmor had replaced his helm before returning to the bridge, but Harrick had known him for centuries. Since the Galmec incident, any member of the 119th War Host would not easily turn down an opportunity to kill more of those accursed nomads. His skull-shaped faceplate could not hide his reaction. Have they seen us? If we can see them, they can see us. How big is their vessel? Big. We do not have the manpower on board to fight them, not after the campaign at Henris. Harrick heard the bitter disappointment in the Master of Possession's voice. He smiled. Drakmor, you have more manpower at your disposal. Since Hendris, the wall between reality and unreality is weak and full of threads. I know very well, said Drakmor, and I know well the cost. Drakmor glanced at the cogitators around him, at the data he had to hand. He did not need to, but he looked anyway. Munitions, shield strength, core strength, all bad. Port decks 20 through 32 were locked for repair and voided, and Hangar 3 was, well, it was still sitting there, but at least it had stopped eating the deck plates. There is a small planet east sidereal of our position, said Harrick. It lacks any significant resources. We can make planetfall in 5 hours. Then do, said Drakmor, and make sure the Astartes see us. The heavy cruiser She Knows No Fear powered towards the planet Aranta after the traitors. Telemetry data had been locked weeks before, and the cruiser made good time. But the heretic vessel drifted wide after entering the system, and the 13th could not catch her. Either the captain was paranoid, or the ship's impulse drives were damaged. Probably both, thought Captain Maven, on board the bridge of She Knows No Fear. Around him the crew were quiet and confident, dedicated to their tasks, perhaps more dedicated than usual, as to the right of Maven stood the 13th's Master of Sanctity, High Chaplain Snow. Maven nodded at Snow, and as usual, Snow ignored him and glared. He always glared, more now since his promotion. Snow had refused the honorific High Chaplain 12 times in the last 200 years. On the 13th occasion, it had been ancient Matthias who had convinced him, though Maven was not sure how. Maven had never known Snow to change his mind. He was iron and hatred, which was why, of course, it had to be him. Closer now, and screens fizzed and sulked, while tech adepts canted binaric prayers and worshipped levers, dials, and hololith phantoms, teasing data from the machine spirits. The spirits were senile and surly after sharing space with the star's corona, but a picture began to form and the central tacticade lit up with red, scrolling information and high-picked gains. Word bearers. She knows no fear knew her prey. They had met once at Galmec 2,000 years earlier, the battle barge, the enlightened truth, up-armoured but undergunned for one of her weight class. No, not undergunned, thought Maven, undermanned. Short of crew with tertiary guns muzzled and shielded, the word-bearers were like that. Ship's crew were sacrifices in waiting. Unless a warship was dock fresh and resupplied, they were often undergunned, particularly after leaving a war zone. Typically, this would never be a problem for an Astartes battle barge. No one would pick a fight. Typically. She Knows No Fear tugged at her leash, sniffing her old enemy out in the black. There were prayers from the guidance pulpits as adepts tried to soothe her, and the primary viewer flickered into life without command, thousands of miles from range. Senior Magus, Naomi thrice apologized to Maven and plugged herself directly into the ship's MUI. The quite frankly cluttered central hololith began to behave as Naomi whispered soft prayers. There would be no void war. The word-bearer's vessel was outclassed and wounded, but still, she was an Astartes battle barge. She was old, saturnine stock, tough old roots that went deep, tough old roots that made her very hard to kill. She had lived through the heresy and she would live through this. She was built to break lines, to push through where others could not. If she ran, they might not be able to stop her. Maven was pondering his options when the word-bearers made planetfall, and the heretic warship pushed for the far side of the planet. It would be a ground war then, he thought. An orbital strike of the landing zone and environs would not do it. Their enemy was Astartes, and they would be prepared for such an assault, either with repulsor tech or typically something forbidden, and much, much worse. No. The word-bearers had gone to ground, and the 13th would have to root them out. She Knows No Fear moved into geosynchronous orbit 11 hours after the traitors had made planetfall, and the assault was timed to begin at hour 13 because Snow had said so. Maven had overall command and laid out his battle plans, silently pleased when Snow nodded his approval. The assault would be brutal, overwhelming, and factored for contingencies. The 13th knew the relative size and disposition of the enemy. They had landed in haste, after all, and were well in range of scryers and battleship-grade Auspex. She Knows No Fear would blockade the retreat with a demi-company in reserve. The remainder of his strike team would fall upon the enemy in 3 detachments. Nephilim Company would take to the skies in Talons and Stormhawks and clear the way, their tasking to strike exposed ground targets as well as chase any rats that escaped the battle grid. Maven would lead a squad of Reaper Company with the elements of 2nd Company he had to hand. Hellblaster squads would prove invaluable against Astartes' warplate, and Lieutenant Krieger could keep them focused. Meanwhile, Snow would command his own detachment, 1st Company Terminators and drop pod support elements. Each detachment, on its own, matched the word-bearers. A single traitor warband, fleeing the fires of Hendris, gone to ground on a nothing rock in a nothing system. It would be a quick fight. The word-bearers did not know the planet's name when they landed, and they did not care. They landed by an inhabited settlement and set about slaying the civilians who dwelt there. It did not take long to raise the town. Drakmor instructed them, taking appropriate prisoners to perform the ritual. 8 rows of 8 humans who had fought back against them for Rage Host Profanus, 7 rows of 7 of the sickliest and dying for the Hollow Men. The word-bearers had lost contact with the demon hosts they had summoned on Hendris, but the Master of Possession knew that the children of the gods would not have forgotten them. A tether to reality is such a useful thing for those that dwell in the warp. Cultists chanted, led by dogmatic dark apostles and their disciples, until Drakmor gave the order. The 8 rows of 8 were slain violently by those amongst the perpetual spiral, a flurry of chain axes and guttural bellows. The 7 rows of 7 were melted away by clouds of diseased gas and foul sludge, wielded by the favoured of Nurgle. The stench of it reached Drakmor's nostrils, even through his rebreather. Then reality tore open. The sound of pipes, so dissonant it even hurt the gene-enhanced ears of the traitor Astartes, blasted from the rift before hundreds of Nurglings spilled forth like an oil slick. Great lolloping beasts on droning, miserable plague-bearers followed, and then the great unclean one, Egoster, the indigestible, flanked by a sloppity barpiper Malcolm the Scabbard. The ground shook as he took steps back into the reel. "O Egoster, great and foul, you honour us with your return," bellowed Drakmor over the din of 1,000 flies. "Should I take this to mean that you won the wager with the bloodthirster Grashak?" Egoster nodded silently. He said nothing, but pointed at the Scabbard, his barpiper. "Though the Hollowman won our delightful wager, 'twas I who earned sweet Nurgle's favour," sang the herald, capering about like a fool. "I see," said Drakmor. "On Hendris, after all, the first," Malcolm sang again, "I left with a tear of Magnus." It was then that Drakmor noticed the great ruby-coloured jewel being held by a Nurgling dancing through the barpiper's feet. He wanted to curse. The perpetual spiral had failed to claim any of those powerful artifacts during the campaign, but this dancing fool had managed it. He could feel the power of it. It felt like someone watching him from a distant shore, from a distant time, a place where gods walked. He turned aside as another voice, as dry and cold as a tomb, whispered into life. "Well, well, well," it hissed. A great, bird-like beast, flanked by gibbering pink monstrosities, passed through the rift before it closed. He recognized the Lord of Change as Beshkar, the Redeemer, an ally of sorts. The great unclean Egoster sprang to life, roaring angrily and raising his monstrous sword. Calmly, Beshkar raised his taloned hand. "Stand down, Lord of Decay," the demon said. "We have not come to fight you." Malcolm jumped forward too, singing, "Not those who play with fate and luck. Go now, off you Scabbard," said Beshkar. "Why so vulgar? After all, you are who brought me here." The sloppity barpiper stopped his angry jig and looked confused. "I have a great interest in that tear of Magnus you carry," the Lord of Change said, its eyes fixing on the jewel. The Nurgling that held it aloft quickly waddled behind Malcolm's legs, peering around them in fear. "I want to make sure no harm comes to it," the great demon said, his gaze never leaving the tear. "I have come to help you keep it safe." Drakmor had summoned demons aplenty in his many years. He knew when to let them play and when to pull them in, or try to pull them in. "Children of the gods," he intoned, "Malcolm the Scabbard, Egoster the indigestible, and Beshkar the Redeemer, we intend to fight and kill as many of our hated kin this day, and we ask only that you join us in this deed. I humbly ask that you fight by our side. Their souls will be gifts to your masters, their bodies, sustenance for yourselves." Drakmor took a knee. Malcolm and Egoster looked at Beshkar. "We can put aside our differences for this matter," said Beshkar. "The tear must be kept safe. It is an instrument of change." It was not as simple as that, of course. It was never that simple. Promises were made, souls were bartered, and plenty of blood was spilt before the act was sealed. By the end of it, the township was a ruin, and all the souls that had lived there had been sent screaming into the warp. Drakmor walked through the smoke, watching little fires move exactly the way little fires should not move, watching shadows pour at the ground and giggle to each other, watching demons. Perhaps he should have felt relief or satisfaction, but he did not feel those things anymore. Instead, he looked to the skies and felt hatred. Pure hatred. The mongrel, 13th. Children playing at the feet of gods. Let them come, he thought. The flyers of Nephilim Company never made it to the battle grid as demons filled the air. Attack runs were diverted and secondary combat patterns were adopted by the Tech Marine pilots. Harassment and divergent strikes pulled the airborne demons away from the primary target area, keeping the landing zones clear. The 13th would be without air support. Maven did not order a recall, and Snow did not cancel one. They had their window and they would take it. Maven landed with the ground elements at Zone Alpha and immediately rushed towards the battle grid. At the same time, in orbit, drop pods were released from cradles and Terminators prepared for teleportation. Demons or no, the 13th were committed and would not turn back now. Up in orbit, the Lord of the 119th War Host, Cordraxus, opened his eyes. He could smell blood and septics and the foul, foul stench of incense. There was always so much of it. It seeped and stained into everything, and he hated it. Hate. That was good. He remembered hate. He remembered himself. He ripped the pipes and machines from his body and rose from the Medicaid slab in one fast motion. Adepts scuttled away from him into dark corners while red lights flashed and machine spirits shouted questions. He grabbed a surgical saw from the table next to him and looked for targets. Bortus was there, chief apothecary, his chief apothecary, quailing in the shadows with his hands up like a pitiful thing. Next to Cordraxus, something moved and he killed it. An adept, with a surprised look on his face, hit the floor, the surgical saw now pinned through its chest up to the hilt. "The Ultramarines," said Cordraxus, looking down at the adept as it gurgled and died. "Gone," said Bortus. Cordraxus turned and stared at his apothecary through the strobing lights. Bortus took a step back, keeping his hands in plain sight. "Drakmor," said Cordraxus. Bortus swallowed and pointed to the Medicaid slab. "Your wounds," he said. "You really should..." But the apothecary never finished his sentence, preferring instead to dive to one side as the Medicaid slab smashed into the wall where he once stood. When he picked himself from the floor, Cordraxus was already there, his red eyes glaring hatred down at him. He tried to step back, but the wall would not let him. "Drakmor," said Cordraxus. "On the planet below," said Bortus. "We were ambushed. One jump from Hendris, Astartes, Mongrel 13th. Their ship outclasses ours. Drakmor went planetside to raise the Neverborn." His words trailed away as his throat went dry. Cordraxus loomed over him, and red eyes pinned him to the wall. It was said that Astartes were fearless, but Bortus knew better. A primitive part of his brain, a small, weakling part that could never be cut away by the transformation process, shivered like a tiny rat below the death stare of an apex predator. "Their ship," said Cordraxus. Bortus swallowed. "Grand cruiser, well lit, battle-proud." "Where?" "We put the planet between us." Cordraxus snarled and pinned the apothecary by his throat. Bortus barely saw him move. One minute he could breathe, the next his throat was clamped shut and the vertebrae in his neck started to twist and click. "You will bring me my armor, my weapons," said Cordraxus. Then he let Bortus collapse and watched him convulse on the floor at his feet before stomping away into the shadows and red, strobing light. Chaplain Snow teleported into the battle grid once Captain Maven had initiated his attack. With him came a full squad of 1st Company elite Terminators. They appeared on the edge of the main thrust in a blinding snap of relocation and immediately charged forward. Their target, demons in machine form, attempting to flank Maven's position. The demon engines did not stop when they saw them. Instead, they turned to face this new threat. They wailed like animals in pain and crashed against the Terminators as a pack. Snow screamed back at them, cursing litanies of hate and swinging his croziers. There was fire all around, burning from the township and spreading across the ground like a living thing. Strange shapes and sounds filled the air as the warp pressed against reality. Bolt rounds missed. Power fists shorted out, and the Astartes soon found themselves fighting for their lives. They took maybe 2, maybe 3 demon engines down with them until all that was left was Snow. He was cut and bloody when the Lord of Ruin came up at him, riding a steed of bleeding metal. The Lord did not slow down. It went through him. Snow remembered waking in the mud and ash, buried in the mud and ash, stamped into the ground itself. Everything hurt, despite the stims flooding through him, and everything was broken. He dragged himself from the hole he was in, bits of warplate falling from him. He could not find his helmet. He could not find his men. He remembered moving away from the fires and into the dark, falling, walking, crawling. He remembered waking in a pod as a kindly face looked down at him. "We gotta go, kid. Back to the Eagle." A memory of another life. How long he was lost in the dark, minutes or hours he could not say, but at some point light returned to the world. It came in the form of drop pod, retro burners, searchlights and targeting reticles. He stood as best as he could and raised his croziers and bellowed out a challenge, and when no one shot him in the face, he started laughing. He hadn't laughed in a century. He had forgotten how. It came out like a low growl and blood froth down his chin. That's how Maven found him, growling and spitting blood and still angry, always angry, and ready to die on his feet. "We're leaving," said Maven, pulling Snow towards the Astartes in the familiar blue armor. They were already firing. They were already under attack. "My men," said Snow. "Gone," said Maven. "We were ambushed, and the ship is boarded." The Word-Bearer's battle barge, the Enlightened Truth, burned at full speed around the orbit of the world. It skimmed the upper atmosphere, leaving ionized air behind, blue and green traces across the face of heaven. The low run was deliberate. The 13th on board She Knows No Fear did not know they were under attack until the void shields lit up. The Grand Cruiser weathered the storm with ease and prepared to return fire as the battle barge flashed past and then away, surfing the skin of the planet back round to the far side. 3 shots was all she could manage before the enemy was gone, leaving the bridge crew in stunned silence. Then the lights went red. "Boarding," sang the machine spirits. "Impossible, the shields are up." "Boarding, boarding." Down in the engineering decks of She Knows No Fear, Cordraxus levelled his combi bolter at the nearest speaker and blew it out. Steam rose out of the massive heat exchangers in front of him. His target. With the heat exchangers out of commission, the 13th would not be able to make warp, and the Enlightened Truth could slip away. The notion of running burned in his gut, and though it sickened him, he knew it was his only option. The Grand Cruiser would smash apart his ship and leave his forces stranded below. So much for the 119th then, so much for the long war. To survive millennia, only to be lost on a dying world at the shit end of nowhere. The gods, no doubt, would find it amusing. They were like that. The spell that had carried them onto a shielded enemy warship was humiliating in its necessity and unspecified in its price. Was shipwreck the price? And the laughter of thirsting gods? Cordraxus put the thoughts to one side, screamed an ancient Terran war cry, and led his men across the deck. He was pleased to find that the Astartes were not stupid enough to leave the Engineerium undefended. There was a demi-company waiting for them, Primaris, their new breed of lapdog. They fought hard, even charging the left flank of the Word-Bearers. They died all the same. Snow watched the demons come out of the black, through the trees and the rocks, out of the rocks, out of the air. They hovered and slivered and flew on great wings of vapour and lies. Reality smudged around them like oil and water, and the air tasted of perfume, a sickly, overpowering scent. His head swam and blood wept from his eyes. He remembered another time, another age, when he was young and weak, before the Astartes had transformed him. He remembered cowering in a barracks room as red shapes manifested in the air around him. "Stand and fight!" he screamed. Bolt guns fired into the whirling dark and ran empty. "Stand and fight!" The company in front of him exploded in blue fire. Astartes' warplate, torn apart, like paper. "If we die, then die screaming the Emperor's name!" Captain Maven appeared behind him. Something massive overshadowed them both, something wrapped in shadows with great wings and a raptor's head. Maven pushed Snow back, and the Astartes surrounded him, pulling him to safety. Then Maven turned and raised his great chainsword and attacked the demon. It was 5 times his height and 10 times as fast, and stepped past every single blow as though it knew where each would fall. Still Maven kept up his furious assault and managed to land a clean strike. The demon stepped back and looked down, as though surprised to find something nagging at its ankles. The great bird-like mouth hissed open. "I am the Redeemer," it said, "and I have not come for you." Then pink and white lightning rippled from the demon's staff and plucked Maven from the ground. The captain hung there for a moment, screaming in unnatural pain, before blasting out across the night as though he had been hit by a titan. Snow tried to fight, but his broken bones would not let him. He could barely breathe, barely stand, and he watched as his brothers were slaughtered around him. With the heat exchanger broken, Cordraxus returned to his ship. The spell that had propelled them through the warp so that they could complete the boarding action and then see them back again would come at a cost. He just didn't know what it was yet. He had seen the Neverborn perform miracles in its time, but this particular miracle, this must have taken a great deal of luck, or planning or scheming, and scheming meant Tzeentch, and Tzeentch meant the Redeemer. He was being played, and he knew it. Beskar would ask for his tally, and Cordraxus was in no mood to give it. So as he made his way to the bridge of his ship, the chatter on the comms came as no surprise. There was a demon waiting for him. On his bridge. Such an insult. The bridge doors slid open, and Cordraxus came into the space like a storm. Deck thralls had fled, and it was peculiarly quiet and empty except for the massive, winged form of Beskar, the Redeemer. The demon held an Astartes in his fist, a broken Astartes in black armor. Cordraxus, unbowed and full of hate, stamped up to the greater demon and pointed his mace. "Too far," he bellowed. "Too far." The demon tossed the Astartes to the deck plates. It slammed down at an angle and lay there, not moving, barely breathing. Cordraxus kicked the Astartes off the dais and down into the pulpits below. It shattered machines with its weight. "You come when summoned," said Cordraxus. "Things change for you. They change for the better. For him." Beskar motioned to the broken warrior below. "Not so much. That there is Snow of the 13th. You know him." Cordraxus nodded. "You have won, Lord Avonbright, Cordraxus. I have brought you this meat as proof. I have ensured your escape, and I ask for no souls and sacrifice in return." Cordraxus stared at the demon, at where its eyes should have been, waiting for the bargain to be settled. "I want the tear of Magnus," said Beskar, "and you will deliver it to me." "The stone? Only a stone?" "It is not only, and yet it is only a stone. That is the price. That is why you live. Your men live, and your ship flies. That is the price you will pay. Gladly." And then the demon was gone. No pyrotechnics, displays of power or spells. One moment, the great demon of Tzeentch stood on his bridge. The next moment, Cordraxus was alone. No, not alone. Down in the pulpit below him, Chaplain Snow opened the only eye he had left and stared weakly at the broken machinery, sparking, flickering next to him. There came a crash as something massive landed nearby. Snow stared up at the face of his enemy. He tried to move. He tried to fight. He tried. Cordraxus put a boot down on his chest and pressed. "Slow," growled the Chaos Lord, "is not the manner of your death." Snow managed to frown, and that pleased Cordraxus. It brought him a measure of victory, a small victory, to see his enemy disturbed or uncertain, to see it in their eyes. It had been such a long war, but he had never tired of the little things. "Only in death does duty end," whispered Snow. And Cordraxus raised his armoured boot and stamped down on the chaplain's skull.
And finally, we have reached the end of the stories I have written so far. I hope you enjoyed them. Happy wargaming.